Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that might make you appreciate your own parents just a little bit more. The worst dads in medieval history. We're talking dynastic disasters, royal meltdowns, emotional abandonment, and yes, some light patricide. You're going to meet kings who turned fatherhood into a geopolitical weapon, emperors who couldn't resist the urge to sabotage their own bloodlines, and dads who confused raising a child with launching a civil war. You probably won't survive this, if only because being their kid meant you were always one tantrum away from exile, imprisonment, or execution. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your city and time. Are you in London at 11 PM or maybe Jakarta just past midnight? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We begin with a legend, Charlemagne. Yes, that's Charlemagne, Charles the Great, founder of the Carolingian Empire, and the guy who somehow managed to get crowned Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas 800 CE. Impressive, right? Except, he was kind of a train wreck as a dad. Not in the forgot your birthday way, but in the you will spend your life fighting your brothers in endless wars kind of way. The guy had about 18 children with at least 8 different women, wives, concubines, a bit of both. And while he was surprisingly affectionate, he kept his daughters close, didn't want them to marry off. His parenting philosophy was a strange mix of Game of Thrones and the Brady Bunch. Now, Charlemagne's sons were lined up like chess pieces. You had Pepin, Charles the Younger, and Louis the Pious, each given a chunk of the empire like it was a birthday cake. Pepin got Italy, Charles the Younger got East Francia, and Louis was off in Aquitaine. This was the medieval version of handing your kids 3 nuclear submarines and saying, "Don't fight." Guess what they did? The weird part? Charlemagne had this vision of a strong, united Christian empire, but he also believed in partible inheritance, the idea that each legitimate son should get a fair piece of land, so the empire kept fracturing. When Pepin and Charles died before their dad, all the responsibility fell to Louis. Poor Louis the Pious. His dad handed him an empire and a family legacy held together with hope, glue, and a chronic underestimation of sibling rivalry. Here's the kicker. Charlemagne probably knew this would be a disaster. There's a chilling moment late in his life where he restructured the inheritance, tried to make it so Louis could rule everything, but it was too little, too late. When Charlemagne died in 814, Louis got the crown and promptly spent the rest of his reign getting emotionally and militarily wrecked by his own sons. The civil wars that followed, plural, basically detonated the Carolingian Empire. Fun fact, because this is bedtime and we're here for the soft chaos, Charlemagne had a thing for elephants, specifically one elephant. Harun al-Rashid, the Abbasid Caliph, once gifted him an Asian elephant named Bulabas. Imagine your dad randomly keeping a war elephant in his backyard while also planning the future of Europe. Peak Charlemagne. As for the scholarly debate, historians argue whether Charlemagne's parenting strategy was intentional. Some say he was trying to replicate Roman models of rule, delegated authority, multiple centres of power. Others argue he was just too sentimental to pick a favourite kid and stick with a single heir. Either way, the consequences were apocalyptic. France, Germany and Italy as we know them, they all fractured from the remains of his empire. The man who dreamed of unity ended up building a blood-soaked family feud. You imagine yourself as one of Charlemagne's sons. Maybe Louis, dutiful, religious, overburdened. You spend your childhood training in Latin and swordplay, praying 6 times a day, living under your father's shadow. Then suddenly, you're emperor, and every cousin, uncle and bishop wants a piece of your crown. You love your dad, sure, but now you're bleeding for the decisions he made. He's dead, and you're stuck fighting your own sons in an endless, ugly loop. And yet people still call him the father of Europe. Irony, right? Now let's drift forward a bit in time and cross the channel, because if there's one thing the Normans knew how to do, besides conquer, it was serve up some truly dysfunctional family dynamics. You're about to meet William the Conqueror, or as his friends probably didn't call him, Dad of the Year. On paper, William was unstoppable. He claimed the English throne in 1066, defeated Harold at the Battle of Hastings, and launched a new era of feudal rule so intense it involved cataloguing every goat in the kingdom. But when it came to fatherhood, absolute disaster. William had at least 9 children with his wife Matilda of Flanders. 3 of them were sons, Robert, William Rufus and Henry. Seems manageable, right? a nice little medieval trio, but what William managed to do was turn these three into bitter enemies before they were even old enough to grow proper beards. You, dear listener, are now Robert Curthose, William's eldest son and the tragic centre of this sibling spiral. From the start, Robert was treated like the disappointing iPhone update. He was brave but impulsive, idealistic but not all that bright, and he had this annoying habit of wanting actual power. William promised him Normandy early on as a sort of warm-up kingdom, but kept pulling it back, like dangling car keys in front of a toddler. Robert rebelled multiple times against his dad, once even going so far as to launch an armed attack on a castle where his father happened to be staying. Legend says Robert actually wounded William in battle during one of these squabbles. So yeah, Father's Day was definitely cancelled that year, and it gets worse. When Matilda, their mother, tried to mediate between father and son, William blamed her for coddling Robert and cut her out of the politics. Then he turned around and favoured his second son, William Rufus, the red-haired wild child who would later become King of England. Robert, the firstborn, was skipped over. Not even a courtesy title. No Prime Minister of Sheep or Lord of Wheat. Just straight up neglected. Meanwhile, the youngest Henry, yes, that Henry who would become Henry I, was playing the long game, watching his older brothers wreck themselves while building up a tidy little fortune and waiting to swoop in. You ever get the feeling your dad only calls you when he wants something but otherwise forgets you exist? That's William's parenting style in a nutshell. Micromanage one son, ignore another, and actively battle the third. Perfect. By the time William was on his deathbed in 1087, he tried to fix things. He left Normandy to Robert, England to William Rufus, and a big bag of silver to Henry with no land or title. It was the medieval equivalent of giving one kid the house, one kid the car, and telling the third, here's $50. Good luck. You can guess how that played out. Robert and Rufus hated each other, and Henry used the chaos to eventually grab both thrones. Sibling betrayal, battlefield bloodshed, and a family tree that looked more like a bonfire. Let's go fringe for a second. Robert Curthose, our tragic eldest son, actually ended up on the First Crusade. He fought valiantly, made it all the way to Jerusalem, and even walked barefoot through the city in pious gratitude. But when he returned home, all his lands were gone, and his younger brother Henry threw him in prison. For 40 years. That's right. Big brother came home from a holy war, and little brother locked him up like a spare horse. Never underestimate the youngest child. Scholars still debate whether William intended to divide his lands that way, or whether he was just improvising in his final hours. Some argue he wanted to preserve balance between Normandy and England, like two wings of a giant geopolitical bird. Others say he miscalculated badly and underestimated the bitterness that would come with splitting a kingdom between squabbling sons. Either way, the legacy wasn't conquest. It was collapse. Picture yourself in this family. Maybe you're William Rufus, craving your dad's approval, ruling England with a sword in one hand and a goblet in the other. Maybe you're Robert, forever misunderstood, exiled, and eventually imprisoned. Or maybe you're Henry, patient, cunning, emotionally hardened by watching your family tear itself apart like wild dogs over scraps of territory. What William the Conqueror left wasn't just an empire, it was a cautionary tale. That power, when given without love or unity, becomes poison, and that the battlefield might be less brutal than the breakfast table. You're standing in the stone corridors of a royal palace, and every footstep echoes with the weight of betrayal. Because tonight, you're one of the children of Henry II of England, a man who was brilliant, ambitious, and somehow managed to raise an entire generation of kids who absolutely hated his guts. Henry wasn't just a bad dad, he was a catastrophic one. This guy didn't just lose control of his family, he engineered one of the most dramatic domestic implosions in royal history. If medieval fatherhood were a sport, Henry would be the reigning champion of self-destruction. Let's paint the scene. Henry II ruled a vast empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, a patchwork of lands inherited and conquered. He was a legal reformer, a sharp political mind, and the first of the Plantagenet kings. But when it came to raising his sons, oh boy. He and his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was no pushover herself, had 8 children. Among them, Henry the young king, Richard the Lionheart, Geoffrey of Brittany, and the eternally petty John. Think of it like raising a group of hyper-competitive lions in a gilded cage, then poking them with a stick every afternoon just to see what happens. Henry's fatal flaw? He refused to give his sons real power. He gave them fancy titles, yes, Land, sometimes. But actual authority, nope. He wanted them to act like kings in training, but never trusted them with anything important. It was like handing your teenager the keys to the car, but gluing the wheels to the driveway. Eventually they snapped. You're Henry the Young King now, the Golden Boy, crowned as a co-ruler while your dad was still alive, but you're never allowed to do anything on your own. Your father micromanages your every move. Your friends laugh at you. Your wife is loyal, but mostly because her dowry is tied to your father's land, not your power. So you do what any self-respecting royal child does. You rebel, with your mother's blessing no less. That's right. Eleanor of Aquitaine, the Queen, actively supported her sons against their father. She smuggled letters, conspired with barons, and eventually ended up imprisoned by Henry for over a decade. The rebellion of 1173-74 saw all the sons, Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey, rise up against their dad in a coordinated family coup. It was like Thanksgiving dinner if everyone at the table brought an army. Henry crushed the rebellion, of course. He was too clever, too ruthless. But the damage was done. His sons would never trust him again, and he never forgave them. The young king died of dysentery not long after, calling out for his father on his deathbed, begging for reconciliation. Henry refused to come. Imagine that. Your child dies asking for you, and you stay away out of pride. Then came Geoffrey, cunning, manipulative, always scheming. He died in a tournament accident, which sounds tame until you remember this was the Middle Ages, where tournament basically meant high-speed homicide with extra pageantry. That left Richard and John. Now Richard the Lionheart was the muscle of the family. Brave, noble, mostly, and fluent in about 5 languages, which didn't include English, by the way. His real love was battle, and his real hate was his dad. When Henry tried to sideline him, Richard made a deal with Philip II of France to invade his father's territory. Picture that. Your son teams up with your arch-nemesis to destroy you, and he succeeds. In 1189, a broken Henry II died after being forced to name Richard his heir. According to legend, when Henry received the list of nobles who had switched sides to support Richard, he saw John's name and whispered, "Now let everything go." That was the moment his heart cracked, not from war, not from politics, but from a final unforgivable betrayal by his favourite son. Here's your fringe detail. Henry II once tried to have his youngest son John marry a Spanish princess who was already betrothed to another noble. When the Pope caught wind of it and blocked the deal, Henry considered marrying her himself, just to spite everyone. Yes, this man was going to steal his son's fiancée and turn her into a stepmother. You almost have to respect that level of chaos. Scholars go back and forth on whether Henry II's downfall was the result of poor parenting or simply the inevitable product of medieval politics. Some argue that his system of planting sons across the empire, each with their own titles and fiefdoms, was a clever way to build a strong dynasty. Others say he created a pressure cooker of sibling rivalry and resentment that no amount of royal wisdom could control. Either way, it exploded. Imagine yourself as Richard now, standing over your father's sickbed, victorious and hollow. You've won, but at the cost of your family, your peace, maybe even your soul. Your father lies dying, muttering about betrayal, and you don't even know if you're the hero or the villain in this story. That's the gift Henry left his children. A legacy of suspicion, war, and guilt. And we're only getting started. Close your eyes. You're sitting on a crooked wooden throne, the air around you thick with the scent of damp stone and desperation. You're John of England, a man remembered not just as a bad king, but as a catastrophically awful father. If medieval parenthood had a bottom shelf, John would be stapled to it. And that's saying something in a world where dads routinely sent their kids to war at age 12. Let's start with the basics. John was the youngest son of Henry II, the same emotionally complex king from our last tale, and the brother of Richard the Lionheart. He wasn't meant to rule, which is probably why he spent most of his youth stabbing everyone in the back to get there. His nickname? Lackland. Because, well, his dad gave all the good stuff to his older brothers. But after a whirlwind of betrayals and battlefield betrayals, John finally got the crown in 1199, after Richard died from a wound inflicted during a minor siege, and immediately things began to unravel. John's greatest hits include losing Normandy to the French, mismanaging nearly every noble family in England, and fighting with the Pope so badly that England was excommunicated for 6 years. But what really earns him a spotlight in our rogues gallery of medieval fatherhood is what he did or didn't do, for his children. Now imagine you're Henry III, John's eldest surviving son. Your dad is out there playing political dodgeball with every major power in Europe while barely acknowledging your existence. John had at least 5 legitimate children and an impressive roster of illegitimate ones, but none of them, not even his heir, were spared from the whirlwind of his paranoia, impulsiveness, and emotional instability. Henry spent most of his childhood as a pawn in John's desperate attempts to cling to power, and we mean pawn in the most literal way. At one point, John offered him up as a hostage in political negotiations. Nothing says fatherly love like, "Take my son, just don't invade." And then there's the legendary moment, let's call it medieval dad rock bottom, when John lost the crown jewels. No, not metaphorically. In 1216, while trying to escape rebel forces during the First Barons' War, John attempted to cross the Wash, a treacherous tidal estuary. A combination of bad timing and terrible weather meant his baggage train, including the entire royal treasure, sank into the mud. Some say the treasure is still buried there, waiting to be found. Others say that was the exact moment England decided, yeah, maybe this guy shouldn't be king anymore. Of course, what really undid John was Magna Carta, that little document you probably learned about in history class. It was a list of demands from the barons trying to put limits on John's power, and like any great medieval dad with control issues, John signed it, and then immediately tried to ignore it. This led to full-blown civil war, an invasion by the French, and John's ignoble death from dysentery while hiding out in Newark Castle. As exits go, it was less royal trumpet fanfare, more tragic toilet break. But let's not forget his treatment of Arthur of Brittany, John's own nephew, and a child he probably murdered. When Richard died, Arthur had a legitimate claim to the throne. John wasn't thrilled. So that when Arthur was captured during a military campaign in 1202, John threw him in a dungeon, and then he disappeared. Chronicles say John personally got drunk one night and either killed Arthur himself or had him executed. Either way, not exactly a glowing moment in the family scrapbook. Here's a wonderfully weird fringe fact. John once tried to make peace with the Pope by offering to make England a papal fief. As in, "Dear Pope, please accept England as your personal property. I'll just rent it back from you." It worked, weirdly enough, but it also meant John basically pawned the kingdom just to keep his enemies at bay. Imagine your dad selling your childhood home to pay off the principal at your school so he doesn't get expelled. Historians still argue whether John was truly evil or just hopelessly bad at everything. Some see him as a tragic figure, crushed by the impossible expectations left by Richard and Henry II. Others believe he was just a cruel, petty man who couldn't resist making enemies out of his own family. One school of thought even suggests he was unusually modern in his rule, trying to centralise power in ways that foreshadowed later governments, but lacked the charisma or intelligence to pull it off. Either way, nobody's writing any Father's Day cards. Imagine yourself growing up in John's court. You're surrounded by spies. Your tutors change every week. You hear whispers about lost treasure and dead cousins. Your dad is screaming at his advisors again, blaming them for another military defeat. One day you're told you're the heir to the throne. The next, you're being sent off to live with the monks for your safety. Not because he's worried about you, because he's worried you'll be used against him. When John finally dies in 1216, you're only 9 years old. That's how young Henry III was when he inherited the crown, terrified and unprepared. The kingdom is at war, and you've just lost the only parent you've ever known, even if he never really acted like one. Congratulations, kid, you're king now. Try not to cry at the coronation. And yet somehow this soggy, emotionally bankrupt legacy led to the beginning of parliamentary rule in England. Maybe bad dads really do change the world, just not in the way they intended. You're in a dark, candle-lit chamber in the frozen heart of Russia. The walls are lined with thick tapestries meant to keep out the bitter chill, but nothing, absolutely nothing, can insulate you from the rage of your father tonight. Because now you're Ivan Ivanovich, heir to the throne of Russia, and your dad, Ivan the Terrible, is about to make medieval fatherhood history in the most horrifying way possible. Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible, isn't just a bad dad, he's in a category all his own. This man didn't parent so much as he ruled over his family like a volcano with a crown. He was crowned Tsar of all Russia in 1547, but he was already broken long before that. Orphaned young, raised among scheming nobles who probably tried to poison his soup on the daily, and gifted with a mind that oscillated between religious obsession and uncontrollable fury, Ivan's personality was the equivalent of playing chess on a board that occasionally burst into flames. As a father, he was unsurprisingly brutal. He had at least 8 children with 2 of his wives, possibly more with others, and most of them either died young, vanished from records, or ended up in terrible circumstances. But the most infamous tale, the one you're living right now, is the death of his eldest son, Ivan Ivanovich. And yes, it's every bit as tragic and grotesque as you've heard. It's November 1581. Tensions in the royal household are high, and Ivan the Terrible is having one of his episodes, the kind that would probably be diagnosed with several acronyms today. He storms into the quarters of his pregnant daughter-in-law, Elena, wife of Ivan Ivanovich, and flies into a rage because he believes her attire is too revealing. That's right, he's mad at a pregnant woman for what she's wearing in her own home. He beats her so savagely that she suffers a miscarriage. When his son hears what's happened, he rushes in, furious, protective, and probably already accustomed to the fact that standing up to his father could mean death. The 2 men argue, voices rise, and then Ivan the Terrible, in a fit of unhinged rage, grabs his iron-tipped staff and slams it into his son's head. Blood pours onto the stone floor. Ivan Ivanovich falls, and almost immediately Ivan realizes what he's done. There are accounts, probably embroidered for effect, that say the Tsar wept, cradled his dying son, screamed for help. But it was too late. Ivan Ivanovich lingered for a few agonizing days before dying. The future of Russia died with him. This moment, captured forever in Ilya Repin's haunting painting Ivan the Terrible and His Son, is one of the most iconic images of royal guilt in history. Ivan's wide eyes, the sheer horror on his face, because even a man known for orchestrating mass purges and torturing his enemies couldn't undo this particular act of violence. And here's your fringe detail of the night. Some Russian Orthodox chroniclers claimed that Ivan IV, in his grief, attempted to resurrect his son through fasting and prayer. Others say he refused to bury the body for days, holding out hope for a miracle. Whether those stories are true or not, they tell you something about the legend. The father who killed his future then tried to bargain with the divine to get it back. Modern scholars still argue over the facts. Some think the murder was exaggerated by Ivan's enemies, who had plenty of reasons to smear him. Others believe it happened exactly as told, and that Ivan's mental state had completely disintegrated by then. This, after decades of paranoia, torture, political purges, and personal loss. There's even debate over whether the blow was intentional or impulsive. Was it an accident in the heat of rage, or did something darker take over in that moment? Imagine being Ivan Ivanovich. You've spent your life walking on a razor's edge, trained to rule, admired by the court, feared by your enemies, but constantly trying to navigate your father's mood swings. One day he praises you as the future of Russia. The next he suspects you're plotting against him. You're not just trying to win his love, you're trying to survive it. And then there's the tragic irony. Ivan the Terrible had other sons after this, but none of them were fit to rule. One was mentally unwell. Another, Dmitri, died mysteriously as a child, possibly murdered. When Ivan died in 1584, Russia fell into the time of troubles, a chaotic, bloody stretch of history with false heirs, invasions, famine and civil war. All because the only man who could have led Russia into a new era had been crushed by the very hand meant to protect him. Picture that. A crown stained with blood, passed on not in glory but in panic. The throne becomes a symbol not of order, but of everything a father failed to preserve. And behind it all, the ghost of Ivan Ivanovich lingers, proof that the worst fathers aren't the ones who forget your birthday. They're the ones who confuse love with ownership and correction with violence. You lie in your deathbed, temples throbbing, eyes flickering. Your father, sobbing, hysterical, king of all he surveys, holds your body like it's still full of life. You want to tell him you forgive him. Maybe you even do, but your mouth won't move and your eyes slowly close. It's a chilly morning in Paris, and you're walking through the polished halls of the royal palace, dressed in the stiff formality of 14th century French nobility. You're not royalty yourself, not quite, but you're close enough to know the smell of danger when it starts to drift through the air. Because something's off today. Guards are whispering, servants are panicked. And then it hits you. Another scandal has erupted inside the house of Philip IV of France, the so-called Iron King, who may have looked like a silent, stone-faced ruler from the outside, but was privately building a reputation as one of medieval Europe's most cold-blooded and manipulative father figures. Philip IV ruled from 1285 to 1314, and if you're looking for a medieval dad who loves surveillance, paranoia, and political entrapment more than bedtime stories, look no further. He had 3 sons, Louis, Philip and Charles, and 1 daughter, Isabella. And while he certainly made moves to secure their political futures, what he didn't seem to understand or didn't care about was how to build actual trust within a family. He wasn't a father so much as a king who happened to have children, and he treated them like he treated his barons, with icy calculation. Let's start with the most scandalous event in his family's life, the Tour de Nesle affair. And no, that's not a band name, though it should be. This was a real scandal, so spicy it reads like a tabloid from hell. In 1314, Philip's daughter Isabella, Queen of England by marriage to Edward II, visited France and noticed something strange. Her sisters-in-law, married to her 3 brothers, were wearing embroidered purses that Isabella had gifted them, but they looked strangely worn and used, as if they had been passed through the other hands. Isabella started snooping. Allegedly, she had suspicions for a while that her brothers' wives were involved in affairs with 2 Norman knights, the Ornay brothers. She took her suspicions to Daddy, and that's when the surveillance state kicked in. Philip launched a full-scale investigation. Spy networks, torture, secret guards, you name it. The women were eventually caught meeting the Ornay brothers in a tower of the Nesle castle in Paris, where their little trysts had been going on for who knows how long. The lovers were arrested, tortured brutally, and we're talking medieval torture here, bone-snapping, red-hot iron stuff, and eventually executed in horrific public fashion. One version says they were flayed alive and then hanged. The wives. They were imprisoned for life, their heads shaved and their reputations annihilated. Now, you may be thinking, okay, cheating is bad, but this is excessive, and you'd be right. Because here's the twist. None of this might have even been true. That's the scholarly debate. Some historians believe the affair was real, and the punishment, while grotesque, was consistent with royal expectations of the time. Others argue the whole thing was a carefully orchestrated trap, perhaps by Isabella herself or even by Philip, designed to eliminate political rivals or disgraced in-laws. In this theory, Philip didn't just discover adultery, he engineered a scandal to control succession, eliminate undesirable women, and send a chilling message to anyone who thought his family name could be diluted by scandal. You, of course, are watching all this unfold from inside the court. Maybe you're one of the younger courtiers, terrified that a poorly chosen glance could get you executed. Maybe you're one of the sons, forced to publicly renounce the wives you once loved, standing with your cold, unreadable father while you watch everything fall apart. And what of Isabella, the daughter who blew the whistle? Well, she goes back to England and eventually becomes known as the She-Wolf of France, a nickname that suggests maybe she inherited her father's calculating instincts. She'd go on to orchestrate the downfall of her own husband, Edward II, but that's a bedtime horror story for another night. Let's take a moment to appreciate the fringe fact buried in all this chaos. Philip IV was the same king who dismantled the Knights Templar. You know, the medieval warrior monks everyone thinks were hiding the Holy Grail or the Ark of the Covenant. Philip accused them of heresy, rounded them up, tortured them, burned their leaders at the stake, and seized their assets to fund his wars. Why? Some say he owed them a lot of money and figured death was cheaper than repayment. Others think he genuinely believed they were a threat to royal power. Either way, he used the same tools, accusation, interrogation, and execution, that he later used on his own family. This man had a playbook, and he never strayed from it. So what kind of father was Philip IV? The kind who would burn down an entire family tree to save the trunk. A man who saw his children not as beloved kin, but as fragile pieces in a political game. He wanted obedience, order, and legacy. But what he created was fear, mistrust, and an early blueprint for toxic royal parenting. By the time Philip died in 1314, he had technically done everything right. All 3 of his sons became kings, and his family sat atop one of the most powerful thrones in Europe. But within 14 years of his death, all 3 sons were dead, without male heirs. The Capetian line collapsed. France was thrown into succession crisis, setting the stage for the 100 Years' War. So maybe the moral here is simple. If your idea of parenting involves spies, torture, and strategically ruined marriages, maybe you're not the Iron King. Maybe you're just a rusty one. You're trudging across the wet, windswept borderlands of northern England, your boots sinking into mud, your armour too tight, and your father's expectations weighing heavier than your chainmail. You are the heir to a throne, the son of a king known as the Hammer of the Scots, and nothing you do will ever be enough. Welcome to the exhausting childhood of Edward II, whose father, Edward I of England, may have built an empire, but also dismantled his own son's soul in the process. Edward I, also called Longshanks, was a towering figure in every sense. Over 6 feet tall in an age where that meant you were essentially a giant, he had a booming voice, a commanding presence, and a sense of destiny carved out of granite. He conquered Wales, built castles so intimidating they still give tourists anxiety, and fought fiercely in the Crusades. But the real battleground wasn't just on foreign soil, it was at home, in the stifling shadow he cast over his only surviving son. Imagine being young Edward II. From the moment you could walk, your life was a checklist of things you were supposed to be: strong, obedient, noble, and above all, not a disappointment. But Edward the Younger liked music, he liked nice clothes, he had, let's just say, a deep appreciation for a good-looking knight, especially one named Piers Gaveston, a charismatic nobleman who had become a central figure in both his affections and his father's seething disapproval. And Longshanks, he noticed. You're now a teenager and Gaveston is your best friend, or possibly more than that. Historians still debate the exact nature of their relationship, but even the kindest interpretation agrees that they were unusually close, sharing everything from clothing to chambers. Edward I had exiled Gaveston once, maybe twice, out of disgust, trying to break the bond between them. And every time you, young Edward, sulk and scheme to get him back, Edward I didn't just disapprove, he was furious. To him, his son wasn't just soft, he was a liability. The son of the Hammer of the Scots mooning over velvet and poetry instead of leading armies? Unacceptable, and yet, Edward kept sending him on military errands, hoping to turn him into a man through sheer exposure to carnage. The results were underwhelming. Edward II once fled the battlefield during a Scottish campaign and developed a reputation for spending more time on his wardrobe than on strategy. You get the sense he was the medieval version of a disappointment Dad tells his drinking buddies about. And here's a particularly bleak moment. When Edward I was dying in 1307, he gave strict instructions that his bones should be carried into battle even after death, so that he might symbolically lead the fight against Scotland. That's how much he distrusted his son's ability to do it on his own. Not just keep fighting, but strap my skeleton to a horse and point it north. Imagine your dad being so unsure of your competence that he tries to rule posthumously. And here's your fringe fact. Edward IV set a thing for teeth. Specifically, he took the Scottish hero William Wallace's teeth, among other body parts, after Wallace was executed in 1305, and had them displayed across England. This was not just war, it was trauma with a public relations strategy. That's the kind of father you're dealing with, a man who collected enemies like trophies and saw mercy as weakness. Historians debate whether Edward IV's treatment of his son was cruelty or just hard-nosed realism. Some argue he saw what the court was already whispering, that Edward II lacked the spine to rule. Others think he simply couldn't accept that his son was different, less militaristic, more emotional, perhaps more progressive in his relationships. Whatever the case, instead of guiding him, he ridiculed and suppressed him. Instead of building up his heir, he crushed him beneath a mould that never quite fit. Picture yourself then as Edward II at his father's funeral. The whole kingdom mourns at Edward III as a Lion of England, but you're just trying to find a pair of boots that don't pinch. Everyone's watching you, waiting to see what kind of king you'll be. You want to honour your father, but you also want to be your own man. And the one person who ever made you feel understood, Gaveston, is the very person your father hated. As soon as you're king, you bring Gaveston back from exile and load him up with titles. Big mistake. The nobles hate him. They hate you for loving him. And what unfolds is a tragic domino effect of favouritism, betrayal, and eventually rebellion. But that's a story for another time. Because tonight, we focus on Edward I, the towering king who hammered Wales into submission, waged war on Scotland with gleeful cruelty, and treated his son like a failed clone of himself. His legacy was castles, corpses, and a child too wounded to rule. His parenting style was simple: be perfect or be forgotten. And so you become king not with pride but with fear. Your father is dead, but his voice echoes in your decisions, and as you stare into the northern mist, where Robert the Bruce is already plotting your humiliation, you hear that voice again. Do better, be me, or lose everything. Spoiler, you lose everything. You're standing in a crumbling hall in Palermo, sunlight leaking through faded murals and columns coated in the fine dust of neglect. Somewhere in the shadows, scholars pace with scrolls in hand, lost in thought. Exotic birds chatter in golden cages. You are the child of a genius, an emperor who speaks 6 languages, writes treatises on falconry, astrology and law, but who cannot, for the life of him, look you in the eye or ask how your day went. Welcome to the distant and dazzling world of Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, an intellectual titan, yes, but one of the most emotionally vacant fathers to ever sit a throne. Frederick was a man of contradictions. Born in 1194, he ruled Sicily, Germany, and vast parts of Italy and the Mediterranean, and was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 1220. He was called Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world, and not without reason. He built one of the most advanced courts in Europe, filled it with scholars from across the Muslim and Christian worlds, and could hold debates in Arabic better than most university professors today. He studied the stars, experimented with science, some of which veered dangerously into the uh-oh zone, and even tried to discover the original language of humanity by isolating infants from all spoken word. That experiment, by the way, failed because the babies died. Let's just get that out there early. But despite all the cultural marvels and intellectual glory, Frederick had one consistent blind spot: his own children. He treated his sons like distant satellites orbiting the golden sun of his ambition. His love was conditional, his attention strategic. And if you were a threat, or just inconvenient, you were toast. Take Henry VII, Frederick's eldest son, crowned King of Germany while still a boy. At first, it seemed like Dad was proud. Henry was paraded through cities, presented to nobles, and told, "One day this will all be yours." Classic Dad move. But the minute Henry started acting like he might actually want to rule for himself, Frederick turned colder. Henry grew rebellious, formed his own court in opposition to his father's wishes, and dared to express independence. So Frederick did what any rational medieval dad would do. He excommunicated his own son. That's right, excommunicated, publicly. In the 13th century, that was like unfollowing your kid on every platform, taking away their inheritance, and telling the church to treat them like Satan's intern. But Frederick didn't stop there. He had Henry imprisoned in a series of remote fortresses, where the former prince fell into despair and eventually died. Possibly by suicide, possibly with help. Either way, his body was shipped home like a cautionary tale, while Frederick moved on to his next son as if he were drafting replacement parts. Let's pause for a fringe detail that doesn't get nearly enough airtime. Frederick once trained falcons to hunt not just birds, but wolves. That's the kind of mind he had. Relentlessly curious, endlessly strange, and totally uninterested in limits, whether in science or in parenting. Back to the family. After Henry came Conrad IV, another son Frederick tried to mould into a puppet king. He was sent to Germany, crowned, and immediately left to deal with civil wars, papal hostility, and rebellious nobles, with minimal support from his father, who was off building palaces and studying Arabic poetry. Conrad spent his entire life cleaning up after his father's half-finished policies. His reward? An early death, probably poisoned, leaving his own infant son to inherit a doomed throne. Meanwhile, Frederick had yet another child, Manfred, illegitimate but beloved, briefly trusted, and eventually betrayed like all the rest. So here you are, a son of Frederick II, brilliant on paper but invisible in his presence. You grow up in a palace filled with philosophy but devoid of affection. You learn Latin before you can count, but your father never hugs you. He's busy composing letters to the Sultan or plotting against the Pope. You're lucky if he remembers your name, unless it's time to move you across the board like a chess piece. And that's what Frederick really did, play chess, not just with kingdoms, but with people. His children weren't companions or even heirs in the emotional sense, they were tactics. When they pleased him, he gave them titles. When they failed him, he erased them. Historians have long debated whether Frederick was a cold father because of his political burdens, or if he simply lacked the emotional capacity to connect with others. Some believe he was too ahead of his time, a man more Renaissance than medieval, who just didn't believe in traditional bonds. Others argue that his childhood, spent as a pawn in imperial power struggles, left him permanently detached. There's even debate over how much guilt he felt when Henry died in prison. The truth, probably not much. He sent a letter to the Pope about it, cold, clinical, and remarkably unconcerned, like announcing the death of a former employee. Frederick died in 1250, reportedly wearing the habit of a Cistercian monk. A strange, quiet end for a man who once had the world's most powerful crowns and could recite scripture in Greek. His legacy was as complicated as he was, admired by scholars, reviled by the church, feared by monarchs, and utterly misunderstood by his own children. Imagine lying in bed as a boy in his court. You can hear owls screeching outside. Somewhere, your father is writing about the properties of coral, or arguing with a Sicilian architect about the proportions of an arch. He hasn't spoken to you in days. You wonder if you've done something wrong, or if you even register anymore. You clutch a book he gave you, filled with maps and diagrams. You want to believe it means something. But deep down, you know, the only thing your father ever truly loved was the empire of his own mind. It's dusk in medieval Castile, and the palace smells like iron and incense. A fire crackles in the great hearth, casting long shadows on stone walls that have seen more betrayal than blessing. You're not just a royal child tonight. You're a pawn in the court of Peter of Castile, better known by his unfortunate nickname, Peter the Cruel. If you think you've had complicated family dynamics, wait until your dad murders your stepmother, exiles your siblings, and casually ignites a civil war in the name of royal justice. Or more accurately, a very personal brand and of vengeance. Peter ruled Castile from 1350 to 1369, and to understand his terrible dad credentials, you first need to understand how he got the throne. His father, Alfonso XI, had a long-standing mistress named Leonor de Guzman, with whom he had just 10 illegitimate children, including Peter's older half-brother, Henry of Trastamara. Meanwhile, Peter was Alfonso's only legitimate son, born to his queen, Maria of Portugal. When Alfonso died, the royal court fractured instantly. Peter became king, but Henry and his supporters lurked nearby, sharpening their knives. You're Peter now, young, newly crowned, and already surrounded by people who think you're too weak to hold power. Your mother, Maria, immediately steps in and begins purging the court of Leonor's influence. She arrests Leonor, Peter's father's longtime lover, and Peter gives the go-ahead for her execution. That's right, your dad's mistress is now your mum's prisoner, and you, the newly crowned king, are complicit in having her murdered in a convent. It's less a royal family, and more a slow-moving Shakespearean bloodbath. But it doesn't stop there. Peter marries a noblewoman, Blanche of Bourbon, under intense political pressure, but within days, literally 3, he abandons her. Depending on which historian you believe, Peter either discovers Blanche was secretly involved with his enemies, or he was already madly in love with another woman, Maria de Padilla. Either way, Blanche ends up imprisoned for years, and rumours swirl that Peter eventually had her poisoned. And yes, this is your wife we're talking about. 3 days of marriage, a lifetime of punishment. Now imagine being one of Peter's many children. You grow up watching your dad switch alliances faster than he changes robes. One day, he's defending Jewish communities in his kingdom, earning the praise of some modern historians for protecting them from anti-Semitic violence. The next day he's brutally executing nobles who so much as side-eye him. Peter saw enemies everywhere, and in true medieval fashion he dealt with them using axes, gallows, and sheer psychological warfare. Even his treatment of his kids was strategic. Some were used to cement alliances, betrothed as toddlers, paraded through courts like expensive livestock. Others simply vanished from the record, possibly casualties of one of his many political cleansings. And yet, Peter seemed to genuinely love Maria de Padilla and their children, whom he later claimed were his true heirs. That's right, after Maria died, he pulled a legal retroactive marriage move to declare their union legitimate and disinherit others. Imagine trying to sort out your family tree when the branches keep moving posthumously. Then comes the big betrayal. Peter's half-brother Henry, tired of being passed over and labelled a bastard, rises in open rebellion. You're Peter's child, watching your uncle ride into Castile at the head of an army backed by France and Aragon, while your father, isolated and raging, prepares for war. Peter wins some early victories, including the Battle of Nájera, but his behaviour grows more erratic. He executes anyone who questions him, Trust is replaced with terror. Eventually he's cornered. And here's where the truly horrific dad moment arrives. In 1369, Peter is captured by Henry during a supposed peace negotiation. Henry bursts into the tent and attacks Peter, but the king fights back, pinning his half-brother to the floor. For a second, it looks like Peter might win, but then one of Henry's men helps twist the knife, literally. Peter dies, stabbed in the face, screaming for mercy. His children flee, hide, or get rounded up by the new regime and quietly erased. Fringe fact for your bedtime brain: Peter the Cruel may have been stabbed to death by his brother, but his body was embalmed and displayed in Seville for centuries. His face had been so mangled that the embalmers allegedly reconstructed parts of his skull to make him look more regal in death. They gave him a nose, a fake regal nose. That's the legacy he left. Manufactured dignity after a life of real cruelty. Historians remain sharply divided on Peter's legacy. Some view him as a tyrant, unpredictable, vindictive, and prone to fits of brutal violence. Others argue he was a misunderstood reformer trying to modernise Castile against deeply entrenched noble power. They point to his support for minority groups, his attempts to centralise justice, and his fierce resistance to papal and French interference. But even the most generous interpretations admit that when it came to personal relationships, especially with his children, Peter was a disaster. Imagine, again, being one of those children. You don't know who you can trust. The court changes loyalties every week. You've seen your stepmothers disappear. You've seen your cousins executed for rumours. You've never had a conversation with your father that wasn't either terrifying or transactional. And now he's dead, your uncle's wearing the crown, and you're praying that your surname doesn't become a death sentence. Peter the Cruel wasn't just a bad dad. He was the kind of father who believed love was weakness and control was king. And when your last words are screamed under your brother's knife, it's safe to say you've raised your family in a house built more for vengeance than legacy. You're sitting in the corner of a grand but dimly lit room in Paris, surrounded by the thick tapestries that do little to muffle the whispers. The air is stale, perfumed slightly by rosewater and fear. You're a child of the mad king, Charles VI of France, and while your father wears a crown encrusted with jewels, he also believes he's made of glass and might shatter if touched too roughly. Welcome to one of the most tragic royal households in medieval history, a palace ruled not by politics or war, but by delusion, instability, and the suffocating dread that comes with watching your father disappear inside his own mind. Charles VI began his reign in 1380, only 11 years old, too young to rule, so his uncles governed in his place. When he finally came of age, it seemed like things might go well. Handsome, generous, intelligent, he earned the nickname Charles the Beloved. But that would change, swiftly and terrifyingly, because as he reached his mid-20s, something started to crack. First there were outbursts of anger, then came episodes of confusion, hallucinations and violent rages. By the time you're born into this royal house, Charles is full-blown delusional. Sometimes he doesn't recognise his own wife and children, sometimes he forgets he's king altogether. One of his most infamous breakdowns occurred in 1392. Charles was riding through a forest in the middle of a hot, sweltering summer, when a man in white leapt from the trees and shouted, "Beware, king, you are betrayed." Something snapped. The king lunged at his own men with a sword, killing several before being subdued. After that, his episodes became regular. His hair grew wild, he screamed at mirrors. He ordered servants to nail doors shut to protect him from invisible enemies. And yes, he believed he was made of glass, literally. He refused to let people touch him, and even wore iron rods in his clothing to protect himself from breaking. Now imagine you're his child. You've grown up surrounded by advisors whispering about your father's condition, but no one dares to say it plainly. You're ushered in and out of rooms, depending on whether he's having a good day or a terrible one. Sometimes he hugs you, weeping. Other times he screams at you like you're a demon, wearing your own skin. And all the while, the kingdom falls into chaos. His queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, becomes the de facto head of state, but she's caught between rival noble factions, all vying for control. The Dukes of Burgundy and Orleans try to manipulate the regency, and soon there's blood in the streets. You're not just navigating your father's madness, you're trying not to get caught in the meat grinder of French Civil War. Here's the kicker. Charles and Isabeau had 12 children. That's a lot of royal confusion. Many died young, and those who survived were either married off for alliances, or dragged into political games they didn't understand, one daughter, Isabella, was married off to Richard II of England at age 7, because nothing says healing two warring kingdoms like emotionally scarring a child. Their son, the future Charles VII, would eventually become king, but only after years of humiliation and disinheritance. And here's your bedtime fringe fact. At one point, during the worst of his delusions, Charles VI forbade anyone from speaking his name in his presence. Servants had to communicate through indirect phrases like His Majesty or the person who sits on the throne. Which makes you wonder, how do you call for help from someone who doesn't even know he's a person? Historians today still debate what afflicted Charles. Some propose schizophrenia, others bipolar disorder, or even porphyria, a rare condition that affects the nervous system and can cause hallucinations. Medieval physicians, of course, had no clue. They blamed everything from astrology to sin to bad air. Treatments included herbal potions, bleeding, and isolation, none of which helped. And with every passing year, Charles slipped further away from the man he once was. The kingdom itself suffered under this shadow. France was divided, disorganised, and wide open for exploitation. The English, smelling opportunity, returned with renewed fury during the 100 Years' War. Henry V scored a decisive victory at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. And in a devastating twist, the French crown, yes, the very thing Charles VI was supposed to protect, was handed to the English in the Treaty of Troyes. That meant Charles's own son, the Dauphin, was disinherited in favour of England's Henry VI, a toddler. Imagine being that son. You watch your father nod vacantly as foreign kings carve up your future. You're told you'll never inherit what was promised. Your mother sides with the enemy, and your father, when he's not convinced he's a glass figurine, barely knows who you are. You grow up not only without support, but under the weight of failure that isn't even your own. Eventually, Charles VI died in 1422, his body and mind long broken. He left behind a shattered France, a divided royal family, and a child so psychologically battered that it would take divine visions, yes, we're talking about Joan of Arc, to convince him he was worthy of wearing the crown. So, Barroso, what kind of dad was Charles VI? One you could barely find beneath the layers of madness. He wasn't cruel, not in the way of other kings, but absence, especially in the face of chaos, can be its own kind of damage. Charles didn't beat his children or send them into exile. He simply wasn't there. Not when they needed a guide, not when they needed protection, not when the kingdom collapsed under the weight of his silence. You sit quietly outside your father's chamber now, listening to the muttering from within. Someone says he's convinced he's turning into stone. Someone else says he laughed for hours after a funeral. You're not sure which version of him will greet you today, if any. So you wait, small and silent, because that's what a child of the Glass King learns to do. You're born into a throne before you've taken your first breath. The cathedral bells don't ring for your birth, they toll for your father's death. The air is thick with incense and expectation, and before you've opened your eyes, you've already inherited a crown, a kingdom, and a mess of political obligations. Welcome to the strange, almost mythic life of Ladislaus the Posthumous, a boy whose very name tells you everything you need to know. He was born after his father died. And that father, Albert II of Germany, takes his place on our list for being a dad so absent he didn't even survive long enough to ruin things the traditional way. But don't worry, his decisions ensured his son's life would still turn into a medieval fever dream. Albert II was the Duke of Austria, King of Hungary, King of Bohemia, and briefly King of the Romans. Not bad for a guy who spent more time dying of dysentery than actually ruling. When he married Elizabeth of Luxembourg, daughter of Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund, he struck political gold. Their union was supposed to stabilise Central Europe. Instead, it detonated it. Albert died suddenly in 1439, leaving his wife pregnant and his kingdoms in limbo. Then, just months later, young Ladislaus was born, instantly elevated, instantly endangered. You are that child. You're called the Posthumous before you've even formed memories. You grow up without a father's hand on your shoulder, without the steadying presence of a parent to tell you when to speak, when to kneel, when to run. Instead, your early years are dictated by regents, noble councils, and competing factions who treat you like a chess piece nobody knows how to play. It's like being given the keys to a house that's on fire, and then being asked to host a banquet. Albert's worst sin wasn't being dead. It was leaving behind a series of succession crises across 3 different kingdoms, and trusting that the people who had previously tried to prevent his rise would now cheerfully raise his son. Spoiler, they didn't. Hungary refused to recognise Ladislaus as king. The nobles feared a power vacuum and quickly elevated Władysław III of Poland to the throne instead. Bohemia, already hostile to Albert's memory, was deeply divided between Catholic loyalists and Hussite reformers. And in Austria, well, let's just say regency turned into hostage negotiation. The boy king bounced between castles and cities, passed from noble to noble like a high-value religious relic. At one point, his own cousin, Frederick III, the future Holy Roman Emperor, took custody of him, promising to protect him, then holding on to him so tightly it started to look a lot like kidnapping with official paperwork. Imagine growing up like that. You're 6, then 10, then 14, and still being treated like a ceremonial crown with legs. You aren't taught to lead, you're taught to endure. Every tutor is political, every meal is scrutinised, every smile is suspicious. Your father's image hangs in dusty halls, but you don't even know what his voice sounded like. Here's a quirky historical detail for your bedtime trivia bin. Elizabeth, Ladislaus's mother, was so determined to secure her son's claim to the Hungarian throne that she stole the royal crown. Yes, stole it. She snuck into a fortress, took the holy crown of St. Stephen, smuggled it out hidden in a chest, and had her baby crowned king while still in diapers. Technically this made Ladislaus the legal king of Hungary, but only if you accept that babies can rule when they're wearing stolen headgear. And the scholarly debate? Some historians argue Albert II didn't do nearly enough to secure his son's position before his death. They believe he should have nominated a stronger regency, laid down clearer succession rules, or even negotiated peace with Poland and Bohemia ahead of time. Others argue that Albert simply didn't have the time. He died so suddenly that the gears of power never had a chance to click into place. Either way, the result was the same. Ladislaus spent his life trying to glue his father's shattered legacy back together. By the time Ladislaus finally began to rule in earnest as a teenager, it was too late. He was malnourished, politically isolated, and emotionally worn thin. In 1457, at the age of 17, he suddenly died, possibly from leukemia, possibly poisoned by the political enemies who feared he might actually start governing effectively. Rumours spread that the infamous George of Podbrady, a Bohemian noble with big ambitions and bigger grudges, had slipped poison into his wine. It's never been proven, but the whispers were loud enough to echo for centuries. Imagine you're Ladislaus in those final moments. You've just begun to stretch into your power. You're making plans to marry, to reform your court, to finally become more than a boy wearing someone else's armour. And then, stomach pain, sweating, collapse. Servants rush in, courtiers exchange glances. Some are genuinely alarmed. Others are already calculating what titles might now be up for grabs. And Albert, he's a name carved in stone, a memory, a ghost. His legacy wasn't one of active cruelty or deliberate neglect. It was something subtler. But just as damaging, he left his son with nothing but burdens, no guidance, and a kingdom full of enemies. The absence became a wound that never healed. So if there's a lesson in the tale of Ladislaus the Posthumous, it's this. Sometimes the worst dads aren't the tyrants or the madmen. Sometimes they're the ones who vanish too soon, leaving their children to fend for themselves in a world that only respects power and patience, 2 things no baby is born with. You're surrounded by marble and maps, velvet and Latin. Your palace is more of a library than a home, and your tutors are more intimidating than affectionate. You are the heir to one of the most advanced courts in Renaissance Europe, and your father is Matthias Corvinus, King of Hungary and Croatia, a man so brilliant and cultured that he makes other monarchs look like feral raccoons wearing gold hats. But tonight's story isn't about how much he knew, it's about what he didn't do. Raise a successor with any hope of holding on to what he built. Matthias was a genius, a reformer, a military juggernaut, and a terrible dad. Let's rewind to the mid-15th century. Hungary is a mess, surrounded by enemies, plagued by internal squabbling, and licking its wounds from centuries of war with the Ottomans and the Holy Roman Empire. Into this chaos rises Matthias Corvinus, son of the warlord John Hunyadi, who climbs to the throne through a combination of military talent, political strategy, and just enough luck to qualify as divine intervention. Once crowned in 1458, Matthias goes on a rampage of competence. He centralises the government. He builds the Black Army, one of Europe's first professional standing forces. He turns Buda into a Renaissance capital, collects books from all over the world, and commissions artwork that rivals the Italian masters. Now you'd think a guy like that would be obsessed with legacy. And in a way, he was, just not where it counted. Matthias had no legitimate sons. He married twice, first to Catherine of Podbrady, who died young, and then to Beatrice of Naples, who was brilliant, politically savvy, and, unfortunately for Matthias, completely barren. No heir came from that union, and yet he refused to divorce her, or seek another match that might produce a lawful successor. Instead, he placed all his hopes on an illegitimate son named John Corvinus, born of a noblewoman he had taken as a mistress. Not exactly the cleanest path to dynastic stability. You're John now, a bright kid with the world's most overqualified father. But no matter how much you study, how many tournaments you win, or how many flattering poems are written about you, everyone around you knows the truth. You're a bastard. Your claim to the throne is murky at best and laughable at worst. Your father keeps promoting you, giving you land, titles, and fancy coats of arms, but every noble in Hungary is sharpening their knives behind your back. And Matthias? He doesn't seem to notice. Or maybe he does, and he thinks raw talent and royal favour will override centuries of legal precedent. He spends his later years trying to get John recognised as his heir, but the Diet, Hungary's semi-parliamentary body, says no, repeatedly. They are fine with the books, they love the army. But putting an illegitimate child on the throne? That's a bridge too far even for Matthias Corvinus. So instead of grooming an accepted successor, Matthias just keeps ruling, and hoarding power like it's a collectible coin. By the time he dies suddenly in 1490, probably from a stroke, though out some whisper poison, the succession crisis is instant and catastrophic. John is only around 15, completely unprepared and utterly alone. Within weeks, the nobles rally behind Ladislaus II, a weaker, more pliable king from the Jagiellonian dynasty who promises not to rock the boat. The Black Army disbands, the court splinters, and the glittering kingdom Matthias built begins to fray like a cheap tapestry left in the rain. Here's your fringe bedtime nugget. Matthias had such a passion for rare books that he created the Bibliotheca Corviniana, one of the largest collections in Europe at the time. It was said to rival the Vatican's library, and it featured everything from Roman histories to Arabic scientific texts. But after his death, much of it was looted, sattered, or destroyed. His son didn't inherit the library. He inherited the silence that came after its doors were shut forever. Modern historians are still split on Matthias. Some see him as a proto-modern king, trying to forge a centralised, culturally rich kingdom from the shattered leftovers of medieval Hungary. Others argue that, for all his intellect, he was short-sighted, obsessed with achievement, but blind to the need for continuity. He invested everything in himself and very little in the people who would need to carry the torch after he was gone. As John Corvinus, you try to hang on. You retreat to your remaining estates, hoping maybe the nobles will change their minds. They don't. You marry well, raise a family, even fight in a few battles, but the name Corvinus begins to sound more like a footnote than a promise. You live in the shadow of a man who dazzled Europe and left you nothing but the pressure to pretend you were ever part of the plan. It's a quiet tragedy, the kind you don't hear about in loud medieval ballads. There are no violent deaths or poisonings in this one. Just a brilliant father who built an empire out of intelligence and innovation, then failed to realise that brilliance dies quickly if you don't teach it how to survive. So here's the bedtime takeaway. Even the most enlightened minds can stumble when it comes to legacy. A kingdom without a plan is a glass house with a ticking clock, and no amount of scholarship, sculpture or strategy can replace the quiet, necessary work of fatherhood. You sit in your private chapel now, the echoes of your father's name still bouncing off marble walls. You whisper prayers in Latin, wondering if he ever imagined you at all, not as a tool or a symbol, but simply as a son. The air in Westminster Palace is thick with incense and ego. You're dressed in velvet, technically royal but never truly free. Every word you speak feels rehearsed, every gaze from your guardian heavy with judgment, because you are Richard of Bordeaux, better known as Richard II, and your father, the man who should have shaped you, guided you, taught you how to rule, has been dead since before you could remember. But don't worry, Instead of a dad, you got a committee of scheming uncles, nervous courtiers, and power-hungry nobles. And what could go wrong with that? Richard then became king in 1377 at the tender age of 10, which even by medieval standards is a bit like asking a kid to manage a nuclear facility. His father, Edward the Black Prince, had been a brilliant military leader, respected across Europe, and the presumed heir to Edward III, but fate, and probably a serious illness like dysentery or cancer, swept him off the stage early. So Richard never really knew his father, just inherited the reverence for his name. No bedtime stories, no late-night advice, just a suit of armour and a reputation impossible to match. So who raised Richard? In theory, the Regency Council. In practice, a parade of uncles. Chief among them was John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, a man whose eyebrows alone could trigger a constitutional crisis. Gaunt was powerful, calculating, and deeply unpopular with the people. He wasn't interested in raising a balanced young king. He wanted to maintain power, keep things calm, and ideally make sure Richard didn't develop too many opinions. Richard, however, did. He was sensitive, artistic, prone to deep emotions and even deeper grudges. He didn't want to be another warrior king like his father or grandfather. He wanted to be remembered. He threw elaborate court festivals, surrounded himself with poets and flatterers, and believed firmly in the divine right of kings. That last part would become a bit of a problem. You're now a teenager with too many expectations and no one to trust. You've never heard your father's voice, but every knight who passes through your court whispers about how noble he was, how brave, how beloved. You start to wonder, if I can't be what he was, can I become something greater? Here's where the parenting, or lack thereof, starts to really show. With no stable emotional grounding and no one willing to challenge his impulses, Richard starts spiralling. He elevates favourites, particularly Robert de Vere, Earl of Oxford, giving them ridiculous titles and authority far beyond what their experience merits. The nobility fumes. Richard digs in his heels. He likes people who flatter him. He trusts them. They make him feel like a king, not a puppet. And then comes 1387, the merciless Parliament. A group of lords, led by Richard's uncle Gloucester, decide enough is enough. They charge Richard's favourites with treason, execute several, and essentially force him to rule under their guidance. Richard pretends to accept it. Then he waits, bides his time, and slowly, quietly, begins to exact his revenge. Now here's your bedtime fringe detail. Richard II may have been one of the first English kings to use the royal we obsessively in his speeches, turning even mundane proclamations into grand performances of authority. "We are not pleased," he would declare with a dramatic pause. It wasn't just language, it was branding. Richard saw kingship as theatre. His throne wasn't just a seat, it was a spotlight. By the late 1390s, he had clawed back control. His enemies were exiled or dead. He ruled absolutely, issuing laws by royal decree, bypassing parliament and silencing dissent. He had no heir, no father figure, and no one to tell him no. His court became a glittering shell, elegant, polished and hollow. Historians remain split on Richard's character. Some view him as a tragic idealist, a boy king scarred by abandonment, trying to create beauty in a brutal world. Others paint him as a narcissist, unable to handle criticism, lashing out at imaginary threats. They all agree on one thing: the absence of his father created a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushed fear, insecurity, and an obsession with legacy. Eventually Richard overplayed his hand. In 1399, while suppressing a rebellion in Ireland, his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt, returned from exile, gathered support and staged a coup. Richard, abandoned by his allies, surrendered with barely a whisper. He was deposed, imprisoned, and likely starved to death in Pontefract Castle. Now imagine you're Richard, alone in that cold stone cell. No courtiers, no feast, no crown, just silence and regret. You think about your father, how everyone told you he would have ruled so well. You wonder what he would have done differently. Would he have listened more, trusted less? Could he have raised a son who didn't need a court full of mirrors to feel seen? Or maybe none of it matters, because you were never allowed to be anything but his echo. That's the legacy of Edward the Black Prince, not cruelty, not incompetence, but absence. And in the medieval world, that could be just as deadly. Richard needed a father, not a myth. What he got was a ghost with a sword, and ghosts, as we've seen, don't make great parents. You're waking up with a pounding head, tangled in the wrong side of a fur blanket, in a hunting lodge you don't remember arriving at. Your royal crown is somewhere, hopefully not floating in your ale. You're Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia, son of the mighty Charles IV, Holy Roman Emperor, and no matter how many times people remind you who your father was, you still can't seem to be anything but a disappointment with a drinking problem. You didn't ask to be king, and you certainly didn't ask to inherit a legacy built by one of the most respected rulers in medieval Europe. But here you are, hungover and haunted. Charles IV was everything you weren't. He founded the first university in Central Europe, oversaw architectural marvels like Prague's Charles Bridge, and basically turned Bohemia into a cultural and administrative jewel box. He was shrewd, pious, multilingual, and terrifyingly efficient. In contrast, you, Wenceslaus, are best known for not showing up. To anything, ever. Royal ceremonies? Skipped. Council meetings? Forgotten. Papal negotiations? Missed. Because you were out hawking, or possibly just asleep. You were crowned King of Bohemia at age 2? Yes, 2. So maybe it's understandable that you didn't develop a strong sense of urgency. And sure, your father had you crowned Holy Roman Emperor-elect too, grooming you to follow in his mighty footsteps. But once he died in 1378, the scaffolding of your childhood collapsed. Without Charles guiding you, you drifted, adrift in a haze of court politics, resentment, and personal demons. Now imagine being a noble in Wenceslaus's court. You've been raised under the golden age of Charles IV. You've read his decrees, marvelled at his city planning, listened to his Latin speeches, and now your king has locked himself in his private rooms, muttering about loyalty while downing another goblet of mead. Sometimes he governs, sometimes he vanishes, sometimes he arrests bishops for fun and then wonders why the Pope stops returning his letters. The papal schism didn't help either. During Wenceslaus's reign, Europe was dealing with a religious nightmare. 2 popes, both claiming to be the real one. While most kings picked a side and committed, Wenceslaus wavered, vacillated, and irritated everyone. At one point he tried to call a council to resolve the dispute but didn't show up himself. It's hard to restore the moral order of the church when your horse refuses to ride through the mud and you don't feel like getting out of bed. Let's add another log to this flaming royal cart. Your younger half-brother, Sigismund, who clearly inherited every ounce of Charles IV's ambition that you lacked. While you're out organising half-hearted boar hunts, Sigismund is scheming his way to future emperorhood, charming princes and building coalitions, and he's watching you fail with increasing concern and maybe a bit of glee. Eventually, the German princes have had enough. In 1400, they depose you as King of the Romans, claiming you're not suitable. That's polite medieval code for, this guy's a clown. You lose the imperial title without even raising an army in protest. It's not that you couldn't fight back, it's that you didn't bother. Now for the quirky fringe moment. Wenceslaus had a bizarre fondness for wolves, not just as hunting prey, but as pets. He reportedly kept several at his residences and liked to walk with them on leashes, believing they had mystical insight into human character. Maybe it's symbolic. Wolves don't care for politics, they just survive, and maybe that's what Wenceslaus was trying to do. Survive, in his own disjointed, indifferent way. Meanwhile, things in Bohemia grow darker. Wenceslaus' failure to check growing unrest between Catholic elites and the rising reformist Hussite movement leads to boiling tension. He arrests reform-minded priests, then lets them go. He promises religious tolerance, then retracts it. No consistent policy, no real vision. Just a seesaw of reaction and retreat. Historians wrestle with Wenceslaus's legacy. Some defend him as a tragic figure, more introspective than irresponsible, a man unsuited to rule but thrust into the role anyway. Others see him as lazy, unstable, and fundamentally unserious. Perhaps he suffered from untreated mental illness, or perhaps he simply grew up with a father so towering that trying to match him became unbearable. After all, how do you follow a man who's literally called father of the nation? You're Wenceslaus, in your later years now, wandering the halls of Karlstein Castle, unsure of whether you're still king in the eyes of half your nobles. You drink to forget, but what's left are fragments of regret. You remember your father's stern gaze, his gloved hand tightening on your shoulder during your coronation, the impossible standard he whispered into your ear. Be better than me. But you weren't. You couldn't be. You didn't even want to try. You die in 1419, without heirs, without applause, without much ceremony. Your half-brother Sigismund inherits what's left of your authority, and immediately starts the kind of political cleanup that takes decades and a small miracle. And Bohemia? It spirals into open rebellion, erupting into the Hussite wars, because sometimes doing nothing is just as destructive as doing everything wrong. And that's the cautionary tale of Wenceslaus IV. His father gave him a kingdom glittering with potential, and he in turn just didn't show up. You're 16, your cloak too heavy for the weather, your movements too stiff for your age, but that doesn't matter. You're a prince, the heir, and your father watches you like a spider watches a fly caught in its web. You are the future King of France, and your dad, Louis XI, is known across Europe as the Spider King, not just because he's shifty and calculating, but because he weaves 1,000 plans and waits quietly for everyone else to fail. And when it comes to parenting, his web tightens with every breath you take. Louis XI ruled from 1461 to 1483 and was, by all external measures, a brutally effective monarch. He tamed rebellious nobles, centralised the French monarchy, outwitted his rivals, and laid the groundwork for a stronger, more modern France. But at home, as a father, he made emotional repression look like a professional sport. His idea of parenting wasn't encouragement or support, it was surveillance, suspicion, and strategic micromanagement. His only surviving son was Charles, who had become Charles VIII, and Louis treated him not as a boy to be nurtured, but as a fragile political asset to be stored, guarded, and ideally kept in a psychological chokehold. From the moment Charles could walk, Louis kept him isolated, literally. He was raised in Amboise, a royal chateau that became more of a royal prison. His tutors were hand-picked loyalists. His servants reported back on his every word. Other children were not allowed to play with him. Any attempt by nobles to get close to the prince was interpreted as a threat. You're Charles now, growing up in a palace that's eerily quiet. No tournaments, no music, no courtly life buzzing with colour and gossip. Just dusty hallways and echoing footsteps, and a father who shows up only to remind you how disappointed he is, if he shows up at all. The most consistent thing in your life is the fear of doing something wrong. You're told you'll be king one day, but every action you take seems to reinforce that your father thinks you're not ready, not smart enough, not even capable. And he might be right, at least partially. Charles was small, awkward, and not especially bright. He had a prominent jaw and a tendency to stammer, both of which drew criticism in a court obsessed with elegance and physical grace. But instead of helping his son develop confidence or find strengths, Louis treated him like a defective puzzle piece. Even as the boy aged into his teens, Louis continued to limit his interactions, restrict his movement, and make decisions on his behalf. Meanwhile, the king obsessed over plots, real and imagined. He dressed like a commoner to spy on his own cities. He kept carrier pigeons for secret communications. He maintained a network of informants so vast it made the CIA look like a neighbourhood watch group. And yet, for all his political cunning, he couldn't bring himself to show even a trace of warmth to the one person who needed it most. Let's pause for a fringe fact that reads like a bedtime urban legend, but is very real. Louis XI had an almost religious reverence for holy relics and astrological predictions. He wore amulets, consulted mystics, and once ordered a wax image of a saint to be placed in every room of his palace for protection. For a man who thought he could manipulate politics like a chessboard, he was startlingly superstitious, and that paranoia extended to his parenting. When Louis grew ill in the early 1480s, he didn't bring Charles to his bedside to begin a transfer of wisdom or a touching reconciliation. No, he doubled down. He refused to see him. He feared his son might be plotting against him, or worse, might simply be too incompetent to carry the crown. He tried to rule from his deathbed, clinging to power with ink-stained fingers, while the courtiers around him watched, waited, and whispered. Louis XI died in 1483, and Charles, now that's the 13, became king. Technically, but he was still more puppet than monarch. His older sister, Anne of France, and her husband stepped in as regents, and to their credit, they did a better job parenting Charles than Louis ever had. But the damage had already been done. Charles never developed into a strong king. He remained timid, easily influenced, and disconnected from the courtly life his father had denied him. In 1494, Charles launched a disastrous military campaign in Italy, spurred more by the dreams of past glories than by good sense. He marched triumphantly into Naples, declared victory, then immediately fled when a coalition of angry European powers closed in. The entire expedition became a punchline across Europe. French soldiers brought back little more than syphilis and regret. The phrase French retreat may as well have been born there. So here's the scholarly question. Was Charles truly incapable of ruling well, or did Louis XI sabotage him from the start? Historians remain divided. Some see Charles as a product of unfortunate genetics and poor health. Others point to the obvious. When you're raised like a prisoner in a velvet cage, you're probably not going to blossom into a confident leader. As Charles matured, he never escaped his father's shadow. He tried to rule, he tried to lead, but the doubt Louis planted in him had taken root, twisting through every decision. He died young, at 27, after striking his head on a doorway. No heirs, no legacy. Just a short, confused reign, and the long silence that follows when the last light in a room goes out. And Louis? Well, he got what he wanted. Control. Total control. He raised his son like a secret, guarded him like a treasure, and prepared him for nothing. It was chess parenting. But Charles never learned to play the game. Now you sit at the foot of your father's old throne, staring at the dented helmet you were never taught to wear. You think of the questions you were never allowed to ask, you remember the letters you were never permitted to write, and you realise, for all your father's brilliance, he never once asked what kind of king you wanted to be. He only ever told you what he feared you'd become. The year is 1433, and you're standing on the damp marble floor of the imperial chapel in Rome. The incense is suffocating, the gold leaf glinting under candlelight, and the crowd of bishops and nobles watches in reverent silence as you are crowned Holy Roman Emperor. Your name is Sigismund of Luxembourg, and this is the moment your father, Charles IV, the great emperor before you, always imagined for his line. Except, well, he probably didn't expect it to take you 50 years to get here. And even less likely, he didn't predict you'd turn the entire concept of royal parenting into a twisted masterclass in emotional abandonment, delegation, and ego-driven sacrifice. And let's roll back the scroll. Charles IV had several children, but Sigismund, born in 1368, was one of the youngest and easily the most undercooked when it came to emotional development. Charles died when Sigismund was just 13. No bedtime farewell, no personal mentorship, just a massive imperial legacy dumped on a kid whose idea of statesmanship was surviving another day at court without getting stabbed. His older brother Wenceslaus IV took the reins of the Holy Roman Empire and Bohemia, while Sigismund was handed Hungary, a prize in theory, but in practice a crown of thorns. You're a teenager now, not really sure what Hungary is or why everyone there seems to hate you on sight. The barons see you as a foreigner. Your claim to the throne is more symbolic than solid. And oh, there's a civil war going on, so instead of being groomed by your older brother, or supported by a family legacy, you're left to claw your way to power through battlefield failures, political treachery, and the constant nagging sense that you were Plan B, or maybe Plan C. To be fair, Sigismund eventually gets the hang of things. He reigns as King of Hungary for over 50 years. He becomes King of the Romans in 1411 and finally gets crowned Emperor in that glittering Roman ceremony decades later. But here's where his dad grade really tanks. He passes down the same cold, dysfunctional, politically transactional parenting that he experienced, only now it's on turbo mode. Sigismund had one daughter, Elizabeth of Luxembourg. Just one, no backup sons, no surplus heirs. You'd think he'd treat her like a precious jewel, right? Protect her, prepare her. Nope. Instead, he turns her into a pawn in one of the messiest dynastic gambits of the century. At just 13, Elizabeth is married off to Albert V of Austria, a match Sigismund orchestrates as part of his plan to keep his family in power. He loads Albert up with titles: Duke of Austria, King of Hungary, King of Bohemia, and eventually King of the Romans. Meanwhile, Elizabeth is supposed to play the obedient wife and baby factory. Spoiler alert, she delivers on the second part. After Sigismund dies, she gives birth to Ladislaus the Posthumous, the boy king we met earlier, the one whose inheritance was a kingdom in flames and a last name that doubled as a grim punchline. Here's the twist. Sigismund doesn't just set his daughter up for hardship, he dies leaving no clear regency plan, no financial stability, and no instructions for what happens to his grandson. He leaves behind a mess that makes medieval Europe look like a Thanksgiving dinner hosted by warring families with swords hidden under the table. Every kingdom he ruled, Hungary, Bohemia, the Empire, immediately descends into chaos. Why? because Sigismund spent decades consolidating power for himself and gave absolutely no thought to what came after. Legacy? Never heard of it. Here's your bedtime fringe fact. Sigismund once held the Council of Constance, a massive 3-year religious summit meant to end the papal schism. And while it did eventually resolve the issue of 3 popes at once, yes, really, it also featured the trial and execution of Jan Hus, the Bohemian reformer whose death lit the fuse for the Hussite Wars. So great job uniting the church, too bad you torched your own kingdom in the process. Back to the parenting though. Elizabeth, his daughter, was reportedly strong-willed and intelligent. But Sigismund didn't train her to rule, didn't protect her from political vultures, and didn't equip her husband with anything resembling a support network. After his death in 1437, Albert had to scramble to hold the realms together, and after his death just a year later, Elizabeth was left alone, pregnant, politically isolated, and surrounded by enemies who questioned her son's right to exist, let alone rule. Historians tend to give Sigismund mixed reviews. They praise his charisma, his diplomatic skills, and his determination to maintain a united empire in a time of total fragmentation. But they also point out his chronic indecision, his tendencies to overpromise and underdeliver, and, most importantly for us tonight, his complete failure to create a sustainable royal legacy. It's one thing to rule well, it's another to make sure someone else can do it after you. You're Elizabeth now, pacing the corridors of a crumbling castle, your newborn son clutched to your chest, whispering prayers into the cold stone walls. You wonder if your father had a plan. You wonder if he ever saw you as more than a contract in a dress. You remember the day he hugged you goodbye, only to tell you never to challenge your husband's authority. You remember the letters he sent, filled with updates about court intrigues, but no words about you, his only child. And when people remember Sigismund, they'll recall the emperor in gold, the man who ended the papal crisis, the ruler who once claimed he'd rather be a dog than a German. But you'll remember the silence, the way he left you holding everything he built with nothing but a screaming child and a crumbling map. Because sometimes the worst fathers aren't the ones who hurt you. They're the ones who leave, telling you to rule an empire, and then forget to tell you where the keys are. You're ankle deep in mud, the rain soaking through your armour, and the chill cutting straight to your bones. Cannons roar in the distance, horses scream, and behind you stands your teenage son, wide-eyed, unprepared, and already regretting ever agreeing to come with you. You are James IV of Scotland, and today you're about to become a historical footnote, a cautionary tale, and a late entry in the Bad Dad Hall of Fame. Because taking your child to war against the English when you're vastly outnumbered, that's not fatherhood, that's generational trauma in plate armour. James IV ruled Scotland from 1488 to 1513, and for a while things actually looked promising. He was charismatic, intelligent, and unusually invested in the arts, medicine, and even dentistry. He paid a man to extract his teeth just to see what it felt like. And while that may not scream stable monarch, James had the makings of a modern king. He improved the navy, strengthened central government, and sponsored some of the earliest printing presses in Scotland. But none of that mattered when he made the single worst decision of his reign, invading England in 1513, dragging with him not just his crown and army, but his son, the future James V, who watched in horror as everything unravelled in the fields near Flodden. Let's rewind. James IV married Margaret Tudor, sister of Henry VIII, as part of a peace deal between Scotland and England. It was called the Treaty of Perpetual Peace, which, as you might guess, lasted all of 15 minutes. When Henry invaded France in 1513, James, honour-bound by an alliance with the French, decided to invade England in return. Yes, that's right. He chose to go to war against his wife's brother and drag his whole country along for the ride. And more baffling still, he brought his teenage son to observe the whole bloody thing. Father-son bonding medieval style. You're James the V now, 14 years old, still figuring out how to tie your cloak without tripping over it. You're not ready for politics, let alone war. But your father insists you come, because someday you'll be king, and kings learn by doing. Except what you're learning is how it feels to be left behind as your father charges into battle at Flodden Field, leading 30,000 men into what will become one of Scotland's worst military disasters. The battle itself is a storm of carnage. Poor weather, treacherous terrain, English longbows turning the Scottish advance into a bloodbath. James fights bravely, sure. Some say he was among the last men standing, but bravery doesn't keep your head attached. He dies on the field, his body hacked nearly beyond recognition. His banner falls, his army crumbles. Scotland loses its king, its generals, and thousands of men, all in one catastrophic afternoon. Here's the fringe fact. James's body was found among the dead, but because he had technically waged war against the Pope's wishes, he'd been excommunicated for attacking a fellow Christian monarch. His remains were denied a proper burial. They ended up in a dusty corner of Sheen Abbey, mummified, neglected, and passed around like a tragic royal souvenir for centuries. So what does all this mean for James V, now a shell-shocked teenager in the wake of national trauma? He's crowned king within days, still reeling from watching his father get chewed up by a war machine he didn't even understand. The regents scramble to protect the throne. The nobles eye his weakness. And through it all, the weight of legacy presses down hard. He doesn't just inherit a crown, he inherits the consequences of his father's pride. Historians sometimes call James IV Scotland's Renaissance king, and he was, in many ways. He built churches, improved infrastructure, even tried to bring in humanist scholars. But fatherhood, that was another story. He loved his children, at least he acknowledged them, which in medieval terms is already a high bar. He had several illegitimate sons whom he doted on and promoted, and he was reportedly affectionate with Margaret and their children. But all that warmth failed to translate into actual preparation. Bringing a young heir to a battlefield you don't expect to survive isn't a noble lesson in leadership. It's panic parenting, it's legacy roulette. So here's the scholarly debate. Was James IV's decision to go to war a noble stand by a man honouring his alliances, or was it reckless, driven by pride and a need to prove himself to the Pope, to France, to history? Some argue he was cornered politically. Others say he was overconfident, flushed with years of success, lulled into believing his charisma could carry him through anything, even an English pike wall. But nobody thinks it was a good idea to bring his son along for the experience. You're James V now, older, ruling in a kingdom still reeling from that disaster. You grow into the role, hardened by loss. You learn not to trust easily. You develop a suspicion of foreign entanglements and an obsession with securing the Scottish throne. You marry strategically twice. You have children of your own. But the lessons your father taught at Flodden never really leave you. Because deep down you remember the noise of battle. You remember the plume on his helmet vanishing into the fog. You remember the way he said, "Watch carefully, son. This is what kings do." And now you know. What kings do sometimes is get themselves killed while taking their sons along for the ride. You're wrapped in the finest silk Burgundy can buy, the smell of polished steel and crushed roses hanging heavy in your halls. Outside, the snow's melting into blood-stained slush, and inside your daughter, your only daughter, is trying to make sense of a future you've just shattered. Because you are Charles the Bold, last Duke of Burgundy, and while you might be a patron of the arts, a fierce warrior, and one of the most ambitious rulers in late medieval Europe, your parenting plan was simple. Have one child, gamble everything on her, and then die trying to carve out an empire that no one asked for. Charles the Bold ruled Burgundy from 1467 to 1477. He inherited a wealthy cosmopolitan state from his father, Philip the Good, and he wasn't content to maintain it. He wanted to expand it. Burgundy was already something of an anomaly, a patchwork of territories spanning modern-day France, Belgium, Luxembourg and the Netherlands. But Charles dreamed of something greater, a third power wedged between France and the Holy Roman Empire, an independent kingdom of Burgundy with him at the top and everyone else knocked politely or forcefully out of the way. And here's the catch. Charles had no male heirs, just one daughter, Mary of Burgundy. From the day she was born, everything Charles did revolved around preparing her to inherit an empire still being stitched together with blood and treaties. You might think that would mean nurturing her, training her, building her up. But instead, Charles chose a different approach. He took every possible military and political risk, hoping to hand her a legacy so massive it would secure itself. Spoiler, it didn't. Mary was a brilliant child. She spoke multiple languages, had a sharp political mind, and was praised for both beauty and grace. But Charles didn't raise her with power, he raised her with pressure. She wasn't taught how to govern. She was taught how to marry. She was betrothed, then unbetrothed, then strategically dangled in front of every court in Europe like the last golden egg in a dying dynasty. At one point she was meant to marry Charles, the future Habsburg emperor, then the French king's son, then someone else, depending on who her father wasn't currently invading. You're Mary now, a teenager trying to keep up with your father's erratic war plans. He rides off to fight the Swiss, leaving you with only half a court and twice the expectation. You're constantly being told that your father's genius will secure your future, that his vision will make you queen of something greater than Burgundy. But as the wars drag on, as more soldiers die, and as the treasury groans under the weight of Charles's obsession, you start to realise you're going to inherit a sinking ship patched with velvet. Let's talk about Nancy. The battle, not the place, although both are equally tragic by the end of this story. In 1477, Charles launched yet another campaign against the Swiss. Even after multiple humiliating defeats, he was warned. His advisors begged him to stop. His enemies regrouped and outmaneuvered him. But Charles, blinded by pride and legacy anxiety, refused to back down. At the Battle of Nancy, he was outnumbered, exhausted, and freezing. He died in the snow, likely abandoned by his own troops, his body left unrecognisable except for the jewellery still clinging to his crushed hands. And here's your fringe fact. Charles's body wasn't discovered until days later. It was so mutilated that they only identified him because of a distinctive dental gap in his signet ring. Not exactly the posthumous portrait of royal grandeur he was hoping for. Back in Burgundy, chaos. Mary, now just 20, was left alone to deal with her father's enemies, her court's suspicions, and her own uncertain future. France immediately pounced, invading territories her father had only barely kept under control. Mary had to marry fast to survive, eventually wedding Maximilian I of Habsburg, a union that would change European history by yoking the vast Burgundian lands to the future Habsburg dynasty. But let's pause there, because while Mary's marriage did save Burgundy from total collapse, it also marked the end of her independence. She became a Habsburg pawn, much like her father had once promised she'd never be. She died young, just 25, after a riding accident. Some whispered it wasn't an accident at all, that the pressures and betrayals finally caught up to her. Others believe she simply broke under the weight of expectations inherited from a man who meant well, but prepared her for nothing. So what do historians make of Charles the Bold? Some admire him, his courage, his vision, his commitment to turning Burgundy into something powerful and unique. Others blame him for throwing away a century's worth of Burgundian prosperity in a single decade of bad decisions. His military campaigns were erratic, his diplomacy self-sabotaging, and his inability to read the room, especially when the room was full of angry Swiss, legendary. But as a father, Charles gave his daughter everything except what she needed most, stability. He bequeathed her an empire with no walls, no friends, and no future that didn't require marrying into another dynasty just to keep the roof from collapsing. You're Mary now, sitting at your writing desk after receiving the news of your father's death. You stare out across a country that is no longer yours alone. You hold the maps he loved, the plans he whispered about at dinner, the heavy golden seal he left behind. And you wonder, why build an empire if the only inheritance is grief? Because Charles the Bold wasn't cruel, he wasn't mad, he was just a man who believed legacy was more important than life, and who forgot that children aren't born to finish their parents' dreams. They're supposed to dream for themselves. The stars over Castile flicker faintly through thin clouds, and in your study the candles burn low, while parchment piles raise like small fortresses of intellect. You are Alfonso X of Castile, better known as Alfonso the Wise, and you are many things: scholar, poet, philosopher, legal reformer, astronomer, and more. But tonight, none of your titles matter. Tonight, your sons are plotting against you again, because for all your wisdom, you've somehow managed to alienate every branch of your own family tree. You've written volumes on how to govern a kingdom, but fatherhood? That chapter never got published. Let's begin with your resume, because it's impressive. Alfonso X ruled Castile, Leon, and Galicia from 1252 to 1284, and he turned his court into one of the most intellectually vibrant centres in Europe. He gathered Muslim, Christian, and Jewish scholars under one roof. He translated Arabic texts into Latin and Castilian, supported science, philosophy, and astrology, and even supervised the creation of the Alphonsine tables, a set of astronomical data that would remain useful for centuries. He compiled legal codes. He wrote poetry in Galician Portuguese. He essentially turned himself into a one-man renaissance before the actual Renaissance showed up. But for all his achievements, Alfonso couldn't do the one thing that would have ensured those achievements lasted: keep his family from falling apart like a badly shuffled deck of royal cards. You are now Sancho, Alfonso's second son, ambitious, impatient, and increasingly irritated that your father won't name you as his heir, even though your older brother Ferdinand de la Cerda has been dead for years. Technically, by medieval logic, the crown should pass to Ferdinand's sons, Alfonso's grandsons. But Sancho sees weakness in that plan. They're young, they're vulnerable, and most importantly, he's right here, alive, an adult, ready to rule. So Sancho rebels, and not in a quiet, pouty way. He starts gathering support from nobles, staging uprisings, demanding recognition as heir. Meanwhile, Alfonso responds with the kind of political manoeuvring only a lifelong academic would dream up: lengthy proclamations, appeals to the Pope, and weirdly elaborate legal justifications for why Sancho should sit down and be patient. Spoiler: Sancho is not patient. Imagine you're Alfonso now, your favourite son is dead, your remaining sons are feuding, your nobles are picking sides, and your grandsons, whom you desperately want to see inherit the throne, are being sidelined by the living, breathing, sword-waving reality of Sancho's ambition. And still you can't bring yourself to act decisively. You vacillate, you scheme, you send envoys, you write another legal treatise, but you don't fix the family. Let's not forget your fringe detail of the night. Alfonso believed so deeply in astrology that he once delayed major political decisions until the stars were favourable. He also supposedly had personal horoscopes cast for his children, which makes you wonder, did he really not see this whole rebellion thing coming? Was Sancho born under Mars and a flashing red warning sign? Alfonso eventually disinherits Sancho and names one of his grandsons as heir. And what does Sancho do? He takes up arms, gains support from key regions, and plunges Castile into civil war. By 1282, much of the realm no longer recognises Alfonso as king. He becomes a monarch in name only, exiled from power, reduced to writing angry letters while his son rules in practice. Now picture yourself as one of those grandsons, Alfonso de la Cerda. You grow up being told you're the rightful heir to the crown of Castile. Your grandfather showers you with promises, documents, and ceremonial affirmations. But when it matters, no one backs you. Your uncles shove you aside. You spend most of your life in exile or as a political bargaining chip. Your royalty on paper, a child raised on legacy and disappointment. Historians argue whether Alfonso X was truly the wise king his title suggests. There's no doubt he elevated Castile culturally. His legal code, the Siete Partidus, had a long-lasting impact. His support for multicultural scholarship was centuries ahead of its time, but some believe he was too detached, too academic to manage realpolitik effectively. His inability to balance intellectual pursuits with the grit of courtly power led to a fractured kingdom and a legacy of internal strife. Others argue he was simply overwhelmed. The 13th century was not kind to dreamers. Alfonso dealt with plagues, wars, economic collapses, and a nobility that sniffed weakness like blood in the water. Maybe he tried to be both Plato and Caesar, and ended up being neither. You're Sancho now, older, crowned, but still haunted by the civil war that got you here. Your father dies in 1284, technically still king, but stripped of authority, surrounded by a few loyal scribes and the haunting echo of unfinished manuscripts. You inherit the crown, but not the legitimacy. People remember how you took it. And somewhere in a dusty library, a scroll bears your name, written by a man who gave you life, then tried to erase you from his will. And what about Alfonso? He's remembered with reverence by scholars, with frustration by political historians, and with cold silence by the generations of his family, who were too busy fighting over his bones to finish his work. He was wise, yes, but wisdom, like a star chart, only gets you so far when your children are using swords instead of ink. You sit now in your study, surrounded by globes and grimoires, the window cracked open to the Castilian night. Outside, the world burns, just a little. Your sons are no longer speaking. Your realm is fractured. And as you finish one more line of verse, one more footnote on the structure of the heavens, you can't help but wonder, would things have gone differently if you'd written less and spoken more? The palace in Pamplona smells like rain and red wine, and the windows are shuttered against the sound of angry voices echoing from the streets below. You are Theobald II of Navarre, King, count, crusader, poet, diplomat, and the kind of father who mistakes silence for peace. On paper your reign seems stable, progressive even. But look closer, and you'll find cracks running right through your house, your crown, and most tragically, your relationship with the children meant to inherit it all. Because Theobald was the kind of dad who believed in titles more than conversations. He thought naming someone heir meant the job was done. Let's start at the beginning. Theobald II wasn't born into kingship. He was Count of Champagne before becoming King of Navarre through inheritance. His uncle, Sancho Seton, died childless in 1234, and Theobald was next in line. From then on he juggled two distinct cultures, French courtly customs and the grittier, more autonomous spirit of Navarre. He managed them decently. He promoted trade, defended his territories, and even led a crusade, because no self-respecting 13th century noble wanted to miss the chance to sweat out dysentery in the Holy Land. But when it came to fatherhood, Theobald operated like a man checking boxes. He married Isabel of France, the sister of Louis IX, an impressive diplomatic move. Together they had a daughter, Blanche, but she died young. His second marriage, to Isabella of Lusignan, gave him more children, including a son, Theobald III. So, job done, right? Male heir secured, dynasty preserved. But as with so many medieval monarchs, Theobald II's parenting was long on paperwork and short on presents. You're Theobald III now, a boy raised in the corridors of power, but rarely in the arms of your father. Your upbringing is supervised by ministers, knights, and tutors who report everything you say and do. Your father's distant voice echoes down long hallways. When he speaks at all, he's always busy, drafting charters, meeting envoys, writing religious poetry, organising court tournaments. You hear about his glory abroad, his titles, his influence in France. But at home, he's a ghost wearing a crown. And here's the crucial failure. Theobald II, in trying to be the model monarch, forgot to be a model parent. He focused so much on securing peace with his barons, expanding alliances, and managing ecclesiastical relationships that he neglected the very people who would one day have to manage those same problems. He assumed loyalty would pass down like land deeds. He assumed his son would just know how to lead. But history, of course, had other plans. Theobald II died in 1270 during a journey to the Holy Land, a pilgrimage turned death march that robbed Navarre of its king and left his teenage son on the throne. Theobald III inherited a kingdom surrounded by predators. France had its eye on Navarre, Castile was waiting for a slip. Internally, the nobles began to pull apart the very structure his father had spent decades patching together. Here's your fringe detail for the night. Theobald II wasn't just a king, he was a troubadour king. He wrote love songs, religious verses, and even some political poetry. His works were admired in both France and Spain, and his court became a minor hub of European literary culture, which is all very lovely, unless you're his son, watching his armies dissolve and his advisors defect while his dad's verses about divine wisdom circulate across Christendom. Historians still debate whether Theobald II's political focus was a noble effort at modernisation or simply an elite form of escapism. Some praise his cultural patronage, his diplomatic skill, and his efforts to balance French and Iberian influences. But others argue that his reign, while peaceful on the surface, failed to address deeper fractures in Navarrese society, particularly the rising tensions between rural nobility and urban merchants, and the cultural divide between the Basque heartlands and the increasingly Frenchified royal court. And in the middle of it all was his son, young, green, and untested. Theobald III's reign was short. He died in 1275, just 5 years after taking the throne, leaving behind a wife, Blanche of Artois, and an infant daughter, Joan I of Navarre. Joan would eventually become Queen of Navarre in her own right and marry Philip IV of France, merging the two crowns and setting the stage for centuries of tension over French control of Navarre. But none of that was part of Theobald II's plan, because Theobald had no plan, not really. He had treaties, he had poems, he had optimism, but optimism isn't a strategy. You're Joan now, too young to remember your grandfather, but raised in the shadow of his decisions. You grew up not in Pamplona but in Paris, under the careful control of the French crown. You become a French queen, not a Navarrese monarch. Your ancestors' laws are rewritten. Your homeland becomes a border province, and when people speak of Theobald II, they mention his poetry, his diplomacy, his bright court. and then they fall silent when asked about what he left for the next generation. Because what he left was a kingdom with no defensive walls, a child with no protector, and a crown balanced precariously on the head of a girl whose father never got the chance to teach her, and whose grandfather never tried. So here's the bedtime takeaway. Even the best intentions can leave behind broken legacies. A king who writes about love may still raise children in silence. A ruler who dreams of peace may sow division through neglect, and a father who governs with grace but not with presence may find his empire remembered as poetry and little else. The wine flows easily in the candlelit halls of Dijon, music rising above the murmurs of courtiers dressed in silks stitched with gold thread. You are the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, and your parties are legendary. So is your art collection, so is your wardrobe, so is your unshakable habit of starting family feuds you can't finish. Because while the rest of Europe remembers you as a glittering Renaissance patron, your children, particularly your son Charles the Bold, remember something else. A father whose affection came second to politics, whose love was conditional on obedience, and who cultivated elegance in his duchy, but barely cultivated trust at home. Philip the Good ruled from 1419 to 1467, inheriting the Duchy of Burgundy after his father, John the Fearless, was assassinated during a sketchy negotiation on a bridge with the Armagnacs. Naturally, Philip swore vengeance, and the next few decades of French history were absolutely saturated with Burgundian drama. He allied himself with the English during the 100 Years' War against the French king, despite being a French vassal, and played puppet master behind the Treaty of Troyes, the one that disinherited the legitimate heir and triggered years of violent squabbling. All of which, by the way, was going on while young Charles was growing up in the background, watching his dad juggle countries like a street performer with a death wish. You are Charles now. Your father is everywhere and nowhere. He's in Ghent negotiating with English envoys. He's in Bruges commissioning tapestries. He's in Brussels founding a new chapter of the Order of the Golden Fleece, his chivalric club of rich guys with shiny medals. But he's never really there. You grow up in castles full of tutors, guards, and hovering advisors who smile nervously whenever your name comes up, because everyone knows what you're supposed to be, your father's legacy. You, Charles, are the living embodiment of Burgundy's future, and Philip is not making that easy. Philip had 3 legitimate sons, but only Charles survived past childhood. That fact alone should have made Charles the centre of Philip's world. But instead, Philip treated him like a backup plan with legs. He showered attention on his mistress and illegitimate children, of which he had 24, by the way. One of them, Antoine, was openly favoured and given command positions in Burgundy's military long before Charles could grow his first beard. So naturally, Charles seethed. By the time he reached his teens, he was already angry, ambitious, and convinced that his father didn't believe in him. Here's where it gets real. Philip didn't just overlook Charles. He micromanaged him. He delayed giving him real authority. He sent him on diplomatic errands and then publicly corrected his decisions. When Charles tried to push for stronger Burgundian independence from France, Philip reined him in. When Charles wanted military command, Philip hesitated. It was a slow, smothering kind of parenting, half affection, half control, and it left Charles obsessed with proving himself. The weirdest part? They weren't completely estranged. They had moments of closeness, hunting trips, shared meals, ceremonial appearances, but everything was wrapped in courtly etiquette, stiff with expectation. Philip loved appearances, and he expected Charles to perform his role perfectly. Emotions were hidden behind pageantry. Mistakes were punished by withdrawal, not explanation. And when Charles eventually snapped, demanding more responsibility, more land, more everything, Philip panicked. He saw rebellion where there was desperation, and instead of talking to his son, he locked him out. Let's break for a fringe detail. Philip was obsessed with fashion. He once wore a robe lined with over 200 squirrel bellies. Yes, bellies. He kept tailors working round the clock, commissioned jewel-studded codpieces, and turned his ducal wardrobe into a statement of overwhelming excess. You can bet Charles noticed. The message was clear. Look the part and power follows. No wonder Charles spent the rest of his life dressing like a battlefield peacock. When Philip finally died in 1467, he left Charles with one of the most powerful and unstable territories in Europe. Burgundy was rich, yes, and culturally unmatched, but it was politically vulnerable, squeezed between France and the Holy Roman Empire, with enemies on every border and a population that didn't always appreciate Charles's iron grip. And Charles? He ruled like a man trying to outrun his father's doubts. He plunged Burgundy into war after war, obsessed with expansion, obsessed with independence, obsessed with proving something, even if it killed him. Spoiler, it did. Historians often romanticize Philip's reign. They talk about his patronage of the arts, the glittering court, the refined diplomacy. But ask anyone who's studied Charles's descent into megalomania and disaster, and they'll tell you. Philip failed to prepare his son for anything except pressure. He handed Charles the crown and said, "Now perform." But Charles wanted something more. Validation. He wanted to know that his father believed in him, and instead he got lectures about patience and snide remarks about his temper. So you're Charles again, now Duke of Burgundy, pacing the halls of the ducal palace in Bruges, where the walls still smell faintly of your father's perfume. His tapestries hang untouched. His chair at council is empty, and the first thing you do, before your coronation, before your military reforms, before the war councils, is order all his personal advisers dismissed. You send them away not out of spite, but because they remind you that for years you weren't good enough. And now you have everything, finally. But instead of feeling free, you feel like a man standing at the edge of a cliff your father built, staring down at a map drawn in broken trust and unmet expectations. So here's the bedtime lesson. Some bad dads don't yell. They don't beat, exile or humiliate. Some bad dads simply fail to see their children as people. Philip the Good saw Charles as a symbol. He raised a banner, not a boy, and the boy spent his life trying to become the man his father never saw. You're sitting at a carved oak desk in Prague, quill in hand, and you've just written 5 more royal decrees before breakfast. The empire needs order, schedules, and 17 different seals of authentication. Emotions? Unnecessary. Hugs? Efficiently avoided. You are Charles IV, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Bohemia, the man who essentially reinvented the idea of imperial administration, and unfortunately also the man who parented like a tax auditor with abandonment issues. Because for all his skill in organising cities, universities and entire bureaucracies, Charles IV couldn't quite figure out how to raise a son without warping him into either a wreck or a rebel. Now, Charles wasn't a monster. In fact, he was one of the most effective rulers of the 14th century. Born in 1316, he inherited a kingdom in chaos, and somehow transformed it into one of the most sophisticated monarchies in Europe. He made Prague a cultural and political hub. He founded the University of Prague in 1348, one of the oldest in Europe. He commissioned architectural marvels like Charles Bridge and St. Vitus Cathedral, and his crowning achievement, the Golden Bull of 1356, restructured the messy voting system for choosing Holy Roman emperors into something resembling functionality. That's the kind of resume that gets buildings named after you. But while he was busy founding cities and rewriting constitutions, Charles had a habit of treating his children like civic projects. Draft a title here, issue a charter there, send a boy off to rule some border province and hope he figures it out. He had 4 wives and at least 10 children, which sounds like the setup to a medieval sitcom, except nobody was laughing, least of all his kids. Now let's zero in on Wenceslaus IV, Charles's eldest surviving son, and the crown jewel of this broken family tale. Charles wanted to ensure a smooth succession, understandable given how messy previous imperial transitions had been. So in 1306, he had Wenceslaus elected King of the Romans, meaning he was now officially next in line to become Holy Roman Emperor. But the kid was 15 at the time, and nowhere near ready to handle the weight of Europe's most passive-aggressively dysfunctional crown. You're Wenceslaus now. You're a teenager with a title that impresses everyone but you. Your father lectures you constantly about governance, diplomacy, the importance of Latin pronunciation. He's got plans for everything, down to the order in which your robes should be folded. But what he doesn't do is prepare you emotionally. There's no time for that. You're supposed to learn by watching, except all you see is a man obsessed with reputation, one who treats you like a reflection instead of a son. When Charles dies in 1378, Wenceslaus is thrust into power and immediately proves not great. He struggles with decision-making, prefers hunting to politics, and starts drinking heavily. It's not long before the cracks show. The nobles grow restless, the church grows hostile, and soon Wenceslaus is deposed. Not once, but twice from his imperial role. His rule over Bohemia also spirals into chaos. with religious tensions brewing that eventually explode into the Hussite Wars. And where is Charles in all this? 6 feet under, having left his son with 0 practical skills for managing people. He thought structure would carry the day, that giving Wenceslaus the right title and a shiny crown would somehow build character. But Wenceslaus didn't need another title. He needed someone to talk to him, to help him understand how to be both a ruler and a human being. Here's your fringe historical nugget. Charles IV had a weird obsession with relics. Holy ones, political ones, anything with a hint of a magic or significance. He collected bones, hairs, fragments of the True Cross, and even baby teeth. Possibly his own children's, encased in jewel-studded boxes. Imagine being Wenceslaus, walking past a cabinet filled with your molars while your father's ghost lectures you through stained glass. Some historians argue that Charles did the best he could in a brutal age. He knew Europe was fragile and tried to build systems, not relationships, thinking that structure would protect his children. Others say he was too focused on his own glory, too wrapped up in architecture and treaties to see the people beneath the titles. Either way, his legacy was both dazzling and disastrous. He handed Wenceslaus a well-oiled machine, then expected him to drive it without giving him the keys, and Wenceslaus wasn't the only one to suffer. Charles's other children were scattered across Europe, used in strategic marriages, appointed to distant bishoprics, or sidelined entirely. There's very little evidence he spent meaningful time with any of them. His fathering style was strictly administrative. Stamp it, seal it, send it away. You're Wenceslaus again, older now, sitting in the beer-soaked shadows of your Bohemian court surrounded by flatterers who laugh too loudly and advisors who never give a straight answer. The empire is gone. Your father's laws still hang on parchment in the council chamber, but the people who made them work are dead or disinterested. You wonder what he would say if he saw you now, or whether he'd say anything at all. Because Charles IV left you a kingdom of rules but no rulebook for life. He taught you how to inherit, but not how to lead. And now the cathedral bells ring hollow over a realm that remembers your father's bridges more than your name. So here's the bedtime thought to sleep on. Even the most brilliant men can fail where it matters most. Charles IV built cathedrals and universities that still stand, but his sons, they crumbled. And sometimes the most enduring empires are built not of stone, but of understanding. You're standing in the Great Hall of Winchester, surrounded by advisors whispering louder than the flickering torches on the walls. You are Stephen of England, crowned king amid chaos, and crowned again amid bloodshed. Your reign is less about ruling and more about surviving, and your legacy? It's a mess of civil war, betrayal, and yes, some seriously questionable fatherly decisions. Because Stephen didn't just stumble into a throne, he accidentally triggered 2 decades of conflict known as the Anarchy, and his relationship with his heir Eustace was a crucial part of the tragedy. Stephen seized the English crown in 1135, despite being a grandson of William the Conqueror through the female line, and despite a clear promise made to Empress Matilda, daughter of the previous king, Henry I, that she would succeed. It wasn't a matter of right, but of power, and Stephen had plenty of that. The kingdom soon fractured into 2 camps, those loyal to Stephen and those backing Matilda. What followed was a brutal, drawn-out civil war that left England torn apart, castles besieged, towns pillaged, and the population exhausted. And amidst all this, Stephen was trying to be a father. You're Eustace now, Stephen's eldest son, impatient, hot-headed, and hungry to inherit a kingdom that's already slipping through your fingers. Stephen, despite his military and political struggles, desperately wants to secure Eustace's succession. But his methods, well, let's just say they involve some of the worst parental missteps imaginable in a time when kingship was less about love and more about legacy. Stephen betroths Eustace to a Flemish noblewoman, hoping to strengthen alliances. Then, in a move that's either genius or catastrophic, historians argue both, Stephen tries to have Eustace crowned as co-king while Stephen is still alive, to solidify the line of succession. But this backfires spectacularly. The church refuses to crown Eustace because Stephen hadn't consulted the archbishop properly. Meanwhile, nobles see Eustace as an arrogant upstart. The move deepens divisions and emboldens Matilda's supporters. Then comes the particularly bad parenting moment. Stephen orders Eustace to besiege the town of Oxford in 1142. The siege is brutal and ultimately fails, but more importantly, it exposes Eustace's ruthless streak. He allegedly threatens to burn the town if the citizens don't surrender. That doesn't win hearts and minds, it wins resentment. and it wins more enemies for his father. Stephen also appears unable or unwilling to rein in his son's excesses. When Eustace's soldiers raid church lands or mistreat peasants, Stephen turns a blind eye, either out of political necessity or paternal indulgence. It's a dangerous message. Loyalty is rewarded, but mercy is optional. Here's a fringe fact. Eustace died suddenly in 1153, possibly of dysentery just as a peace agreement was about to be negotiated. His death threw Stephen's plans into chaos. Suddenly, the man who had spent years trying to secure his son's throne found himself without an heir, forcing him to negotiate directly with Matilda's son, Henry Plantagenet, who would become Henry II and founder of the Plantagenet dynasty. Talk about bad timing. Historians debate whether Stephen's failure to properly prepare Eustace was a cause or a symptom of the wider collapse. Was Eustace unfit because of his father's mismanagement, or was Stephen overwhelmed by civil war and simply unable to provide guidance amid chaos? Some argue Stephen was too focused on survival to be a father, while others see a man whose affection for his son clouded his judgment. Imagine being Eustace growing up with a father fighting for his life and kingdom. You're expected to be a warrior prince, yet the kingdom is unravelling. You try to make your mark, to earn respect, but you're surrounded by suspicion and betrayal, and no matter how hard you push, you remain the son of a man fighting a losing battle, both politically and personally. When Stephen died in 1154, he passed the crown not to his son, but to Henry II. The anarchy ended, but the legacy of a father and son locked in a tragic struggle lingered on. Stephen's reign was marked by his efforts to hold a kingdom together, but as a father he left a warning. No throne is secure without the steady hand of guidance, and no legacy can survive a father's absence in the heart. So as you sit alone in your chambers, with echoes of siege engines and broken promises still ringing in your ears, you realise that the worst battles sometimes aren't fought on fields but within families, and sometimes the fiercest enemies are the ones we're born to love. The church bells toll mournfully over a fog-laden German town where the thick scent of damp earth mingles with smoke from hearth fires. You are Henry IV of Germany, crowned King of the Romans and King of Germany, but forever haunted by whispers and excommunication. You've got a crown heavy with promise and a kingdom even heavier with distrust. Your reign is marked by rebellion, disgrace, and there's a kind of father-son conflict that would make even a saint weep. Because when it comes to fatherhood, Henry IV is the epitome of losing your crown and your kid. Born in 1050, Henry IV inherited the Salian dynasty's imperial ambitions, but his life was a constant struggle, not just with rival nobles, rebellious bishops, and angry emperors, but with his own family. His father, Henry III, died when he was just 6, and from that moment the young prince's path was shaped by guardians and regents who often saw him as a pawn. When Henry IV finally came into power, he inherited a fractious empire in desperate need of unity, and a legacy of fatherly absence that left him ill-prepared. You are Henry IV now, a king in title but a child in spirit, battling enemies within and without. The most famous conflict of your reign, the investiture controversy, is not just a political struggle with Pope Gregory VII, but a deeply personal battle over authority, legitimacy and respect. And through it all, your relationship with your own son, Henry V, turns bitter, violent and tragically public. Henry IV tried to assert imperial authority over the church, appointing bishops and abbots without papal approval. This earned him the Pope's wrath and excommunication in 1076. In a dramatic and humiliating move, he travelled to Canossa in 1077, standing barefoot in the snow to beg for forgiveness. It was a powerful image of submission, but not the end of the conflict. Henry's grip on the empire weakened, his power fractured, and his enemies multiplied. Meanwhile, your son Henry V, initially loyal, grows restless and ambitious. As your fortunes decline, he sides with your enemies, culminating in a revolt that forces you to abdicate in 1105. But the story gets darker. After the abdication, Henry IV is imprisoned by his son, treated cruelly, and left to die in captivity in 1106. Father against son, king against heir, blood against blood. Imagine being Henry IV in those final days, the man who once ruled an empire now confined to a dungeon, watching his son take the crown he was forced to relinquish, the same son who raised, taught, and expected to succeed him. What did he see in his son's eyes? Pride, resentment, mercy? Probably none of those. Instead, a cold political calculation that ensured the Salian dynasty's continuation, at the cost of family bonds. Here's a fringe fact for your nighttime reflections. Henry IV reportedly composed poetry during his imprisonment, reflecting on his downfall, fate, and the nature of kingship. Not bad for a disgraced monarch stuck behind bars. His verses reveal a man grappling with his failures, both as a ruler and a father. The humanity behind the crown is startling. Historians continue to debate Henry IV's legacy. Was he a tyrant doomed by ambition? A victim of church politics? A father destroyed by the very system he fought to control? Some argue his downfall was inevitable given the power struggles of the time. Others see a personal tragedy, a man whose desire for control undermined his ability to nurture his family and his kingdom alike. You are Henry V now, sitting on the throne your father lost, with all the power and none of the peace. You remember your father's face the last time you saw him, worn, broken, betrayed. You carry his crown, his name, and his mistakes. And as you look out over the empire, you wonder, how much of your rule is shaped by love, and how much by the bitterness of a son who had no choice but to take his father down? Because in medieval history, sometimes the worst fathers aren't the cruelest tyrants. Sometimes there are the men who lose everything, except their children's wrath. You're perched on the cold stone steps of a crumbling castle in 1066 England, the wind whipping your hair into your eyes as you watch the banners flutter and armies assemble. You are Harold Godwinson, last Anglo-Saxon King of England, and your father, Godwin, Earl of Wessex, was a man whose ambitions and political machinations shaped your life in ways you might not have fully understood until it was too late. Godwin wasn't your typical dad. He was a power broker, a kingmaker, and a man whose love was often eclipsed by his drive for influence. The story of Harold and Godwin is the tragic blueprint for how medieval fatherhood could make or break a dynasty, and in this case it shattered an entire kingdom. Godwin was a towering figure in early 11th century England. His rise from a relatively minor nobleman to the most powerful earl in the country was marked by ruthlessness and savvy political moves. He married strategically, including to Gytha Thorkelsdotter, a Danish noblewoman, to consolidate power. His family, the Godwins, became the dominant force in English politics. Harold was his eldest son, groomed for leadership from a young age, but Godwin's style of parenting was less about nurturing and more about wielding power. Imagine growing up under Godwin's shadow. Harold wasn't just a son, he was an extension of his father's ambitions. Godwin manoeuvred him into key roles, Earl of Wessex and even regent during King Edward the Confessor's reign, expecting him to secure the family's grip on the throne. But Godwin's heavy-handed approach often sowed resentment among other nobles, and created enemies who would later exploit Harold's weaknesses. The pivotal moment came in 1051 when Godwin fell out of favour with King Edward and was exiled. Harold went with him, spending years in Normandy, living in exile and forging uneasy alliances with future rivals. Godwin returned in 1052, with Harold leading the charge to reclaim their power. The restoration was swift but not without cost. It deepened divisions in the kingdom and set the stage for a volatile succession. When Edward the Confessor died in 1066 without an heir, Harold seized the crown, but his claim was contested by William, Duke of Normandy, and Harold Hardrada of Norway. You know how this ends: the brutal Battle of Stamford Bridge, a victorious but exhausting fight against Hardrada, followed by the devastating defeat at Hastings against William, where Harold fell, arrow in eye as legend has it, ending Anglo-Saxon rule. But what about Godwin's role? Did his relentless push for power prepare Harold to rule a fractured kingdom? Or did it leave him vulnerable, too reliant on his father's legacy and enemies' grudges? Historians argue both. Some say Godwin's aggressive politics hardened Harold into a capable, if overburdened, leader. Others believe Godwin's polarising style left Harold isolated when he most needed support. Here's a fringe fact. Godwin's family was famous for their physical stature. Chroniclers described them as giants among men. Harold himself was said to be tall and strong, a warrior king by nature, if not by fate. But strength alone wasn't enough to overcome the political storms Godwin's legacy had brewed. Now picture Harold in his final moments, a king who never really ruled alone, caught between the weight of his father's ambitions and the harsh realities of conquest. His reign was short, turbulent, and ultimately tragic. And his legacy? A lesson in how a father's shadow can both empower and suffocate, how love mixed with power can either build or break. As the dust settles on Hastings and the Normans raise their banners, you realise medieval fatherhood isn't just about blood or titles. It's about how ambition, love, and expectation collide, sometimes with catastrophic consequences. And in that collision, entire kingdoms can fall,